I've been thinking about whether I should tell this story or not. It's been 3 years now, and I still can't quite shake the feeling that talking about it might somehow, I don't know, reopen something that's better left closed. But I suppose keeping it to myself hasn't exactly helped either. The thing is, it started so innocently. That's what gets me. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't trying to find something illegal or dangerous. I was just curious. Back then, I was working in a call center in Manchester. It was absolutely soul-destroying work, the sort of job where you watch the clock and every minute feels like an hour. I'd go home to my flat, microwave something for dinner, and spend the rest of the evening online. Not doing anything particularly interesting, mind you, just browsing really. Reddit, YouTube, the usual time wasters. I'd heard people talk about the dark web before, obviously. Everyone has. But I'd always assumed it was either completely inaccessible to ordinary people or just full of scams and FBI honeypots. Then one evening, I was reading something about internet privacy, and the article mentioned how easy it actually was to access. That surprised me. I'd built it up in my head as this incredibly complex thing that required specialist knowledge. Turns out it's not. There's software you can download, free and open source, that lets you browse anonymously. Takes maybe 10 minutes to set up, so I did it. Just like that. Downloaded the software, installed it, and suddenly I was looking at a completely different internet. The first thing that struck me was how amateurish it all looked. Nothing like the slick modern websites you're used to. Most sites were just black backgrounds with green or white text, like something from the early 90s. Lots of broken links. Lots of sites that wouldn't load at all. I spent the first hour or so just clicking around, not really finding anything particularly interesting. There were some forums, a few marketplaces that looked dodgy as hell, sites offering services I had no intention of using. It was simultaneously more boring and more unsettling than I'd expected. But then I found something called the repository. It wasn't advertised anywhere. I found it through a random link on one of those directory pages that list dark websites. The description was vague, something like curated collection of rare materials. No screenshots, no reviews, just an address. When I clicked through, the site was different from the others I'd seen. Still minimal, but cleaner somehow, more organized. The homepage was simple, a search bar and a list of categories. Things like documents, images, media, personal. That last one caught my attention. I clicked on it. A new page loaded with what looked like hundreds of folders, each labeled with just a date and a location. 2019 Birmingham, 2021 London, 2018 Leeds. I picked one at random. Inside were more folders, these ones labeled with what appeared to be initials. I clicked on one of those. Inside were photographs. They were just normal photos. Someone's birthday party. A woman in her 30s maybe, blowing out candles on a cake. A group of people laughing in the background. A living room decorated with balloons. The next photo showed the same people sitting around a dinner table. Nothing sinister, nothing obviously wrong with any of it. But I felt uncomfortable looking at them. These were private photographs, family photographs, and they were here on the dark web, organized into folders by someone who definitely wasn't supposed to have them. I backed out and tried another folder. This time, the photos were from someone's holiday, beach shots, sunsets, a couple in their 60s posing outside a restaurant. Again, completely ordinary images that had no business being where they were. I started clicking through more folders, and they were all the same. Personal photographs, clearly taken from people's phones or computers, uploaded and catalogued by location and date. The thing that really disturbed me was how recent some of them were. I found folders from just a few months earlier. Photos of children opening Christmas presents, a family gathered around a television, someone's new car. These weren't old leaked photos from some ancient data breach. These were current, fresh, ongoing. I should have closed it then. I knew I should have. But I kept looking. I started recognizing some of the locations. One folder was labeled 2022 Stockport. That's maybe 8 miles from where I lived. I opened it, and there were dozens of subfolders inside. I clicked on one at random. The photos showed a house I didn't recognize, but the area looked familiar. Someone's back garden, their kitchen, close-up shots of documents on their counter, a gas bill, clear enough to read the address. I looked up the street on Google Maps. It was real. The house was real. These were photographs from inside someone's home in Stockport, taken within the last year or so, and they were sitting here in this collection for anyone to access. My hands felt cold. I closed the folder and sat back from my laptop, trying to work out what I was looking at. Was this hacked phones, hacked security cameras? I'd read about smart home devices being vulnerable, cameras that people install to monitor their property but don't secure properly. Maybe that was it. Maybe this was just a collection of footage from unsecured devices. Still illegal, still disturbing, but at least it made sense. But then I made a mistake. I searched for my own area. I typed in my postcode, and a folder appeared. I stared at it for a long time before I clicked. My chest felt tight. The folder loaded, and there were 3 subfolders inside, each with a set of initials I didn't recognize. I clicked on the first one. The photos were from a flat I didn't know, showing rooms I'd never seen. Relief washed over me. It wasn't my building. I tried the second folder, same thing. Different flat, different area, but still within my postcode. The third folder took longer to load. When it did, I felt something drop inside my stomach. It was my building, my actual building. The photos showed the entrance hall downstairs, the one with the post boxes and the door that never locks properly. The next photo showed the stairwell, the one I walked up every single day, the carpet, the scuffed walls, the window on the landing between the first and second floors. Then photos of the second floor corridor, my corridor. My door was visible in one of the shots, right there at the end of the hall, exactly where it should be. I couldn't breathe properly. Someone had been in my building. Someone had walked up those stairs, stood in that corridor, and taken photographs. Then they'd uploaded them here. The photos were dated 3 weeks ago. I stood up from my desk and walked to my window. I lived on the second floor, facing the street. From where I stood, I could see the bus stop across the road, the small Sainsbury's local on the corner, the kebab shop that was always open late. Everything looked normal. A few people walking past, cars driving by, the streetlights casting their orange glow over the wet pavement. Nothing unusual, nothing wrong. I went back to my laptop. My hands were shaking now, and I had to try twice to click on the next photo. It showed my door, just my door, a close-up shot, clear enough to see the number, clear enough to see the small dent near the handle where I dropped my keys once and chipped the paint. There were no photos from inside my flat. That was something. But someone had stood right outside my door and taken this picture. Someone had been that close. I closed the laptop. I didn't shut it down. I just folded the screen down and stepped away from it like it might bite me. I checked my front door. Locked. The chain was on. I looked through the peephole. The corridor was empty, poorly lit as always, the flickering bulb at the far end doing its usual stuttering routine. Everything looked the same as it always did. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept getting up to check the door, to look out the window, to convince myself that everything was fine. In the morning, I told myself I'd overreacted. So what if someone had taken photos in my building? It was probably just some creep with too much time on their hands, documenting random locations for reasons I couldn't understand. It didn't mean they were targeting me specifically. It didn't mean I was in danger. I went to work. I tried to focus on my calls, on the scripts I'd read 1,000 times, on the customers who were angry about their bills or their service, or whatever else they decided to complain about that day. But I kept thinking about those photos. I kept seeing my door, my corridor, my building. When I got home that evening, I checked the dark website again. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought the photos would be gone, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But they were still there. My building, my corridor, my door. I clicked through them again, studying each one, trying to spot something I'd missed before, some detail that might tell me who'd taken them or why. Then I noticed something. In one of the photos, the one showing the full length of the corridor, there was a door open, not mine, the flat 3 doors down from me. The light was on inside, and I could just about make out the edge of a sofa, a bit of wall, a corner of a picture frame. I didn't know who lived there. I'd seen the person a few times, a man in his 40s maybe, always wearing a suit, always in a hurry. We'd never spoken beyond a quick nod in passing. I went back to the main folder. There were those 3 subfolders, each with initials. I'd only looked at the third one, the one with photos of my building. I clicked on the first one again, the one I'd dismissed earlier. The photos loaded. A living room I didn't recognize, a kitchen, a bedroom. Personal photos on a wall, too blurry to make out clearly. A bathroom. Then a photo taken from a doorway, showing a sofa, a television, a bit of wall, a picture frame. It was the same flat, the one 3 doors down from me. These weren't just exterior shots. Someone had been inside that flat. They'd walked through it, photographed every room, and uploaded the whole collection. The other subfolder showed a different flat, somewhere else in the building. I recognized the layout, but not the furniture. Ground floor, maybe. I'd never been in any of my neighbors' flats, so I couldn't be sure. But someone else had. Someone had walked through this building, entered at least 2 flats, photographed everything, and uploaded it all to this site. I went back to the photo of my door, just the door. Nothing from inside. Why? Why photograph the interior of other flats but not mine? Had they tried and failed to get in? Had they not tried at all? Was my door just documentation, a marker, something to return to later? That thought sat in my stomach like a stone. I checked the dates again. 3 weeks ago. I tried to remember where I'd been 3 weeks ago. Had I been at work? Obviously. I was always at work. But what about evenings, weekends? I couldn't remember. My days blurred together back then. Call center shifts, home, sleep, repeat. I could have been out. I could have been in. I had no idea. I started checking the site every day. I don't know why. Maybe I thought, if I kept watching, I'd see new photos appear and I'd know something was happening. Or maybe I just needed to feel like I had some control, some awareness of the situation. The folders didn't update. The photos stayed the same. My building, my corridor, my door. Nothing new. But then, about a week later, I noticed something else. The main folder for my postcode had a new subfolder, different initials. I clicked on it before I could talk myself out of it. The photos showed another building, a few streets away from mine. Same setup. Entrance hall, stairwell, corridors, doors, close-ups of specific flats, and then interior shots, someone's kitchen, their bedroom, a desk with a laptop on it, papers scattered around, all of it clearly visible. This was still happening. Whoever was doing this was still active, still going into buildings, still photographing flats, still uploading everything to this collection. I thought about going to the police. I really did. But what would I tell them? I was browsing the dark web and found some photos of my building. Would they even take me seriously? And what could they do anyway? The site was anonymous. The person uploading the photos was anonymous. There were no names, no identifying information, just initials and locations and dates. So I did nothing. I just kept checking the site, kept looking at those photos, kept waiting for something to happen. Then something did happen. I came home from work one evening, maybe 2 weeks after I'd first found the photos, and my door was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, maybe an inch or so. Enough that I noticed immediately. I stopped in the corridor, my key still in my hand, and stared at it. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I always locked it. I was obsessive about it, especially after finding those photos. I pushed the door open slowly. The chain was off. It had been on when I left. I was certain of that. The flat was dark except for the light from the corridor behind me. I stood in the doorway, listening. Nothing. No sounds. No movement. I stepped inside and turned on the light. Everything looked normal. My shoes by the door where I always left them. My jacket on the hook. The kitchen straight ahead, clean because I hadn't cooked anything in days. I walked through the flat slowly, turning on every light, checking every room. The bathroom was empty. The bedroom was untouched. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. But someone had been inside. I knew it. The door had been locked, and now it was open. The chain had been on, and now it was off. I checked my laptop, still on my desk where I'd left it. I opened it and checked the dark website. The folder for my building hadn't updated. No new photos. I checked the browser history. Nothing unusual. I checked everything I could think of, looking for some sign that someone had used my computer, but there was nothing. Then I noticed my bedside table. The drawer was open, just slightly. I never left it open. Inside was the usual nonsense. Old receipts, chargers, batteries, a screwdriver, some coins. I picked through it, trying to remember what had been there, trying to work out if anything was missing. I couldn't tell. It was just random junk, accumulated over months, things I'd thrown in there and forgotten about. But someone had opened that drawer. Someone had looked through it. I didn't sleep in my flat that night. I grabbed some clothes, my laptop, my phone charger, and I left. I stayed with a friend in Salford, told him I'd had a problem with the heating, and the landlord was sorting it out. He didn't ask questions. I spent the night on his sofa, checking the dark website every couple of hours, waiting for new photos to appear. Photos from inside my flat, photos of my bedroom, my kitchen, my things, but nothing appeared. I went back the next day. The door was locked, exactly as I'd left it. The flat was empty. Nothing had changed. I checked everything again. Laptop, drawers, cupboards, wardrobes. Everything seemed fine. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock the door properly. Maybe the chain had slipped off somehow. Maybe the drawer had been open all along and I just hadn't noticed. But I knew that wasn't true. I started keeping a record. I took photos of my flat before I left each day. My desk, my bedside table, my kitchen counter. Then I'd check them when I got home, comparing everything to make sure nothing had moved. For a week, everything stayed the same. I started to relax slightly. Maybe it had been a one-off. Maybe whoever it was had moved on to other buildings, other flats. Then I checked the site and found a new folder. My postcode, my building, new initials, the photos loaded, my entrance hall, my stairwell, my corridor, and then my flat, my actual flat, photos taken from inside, my living room, showing my sofa, my television, my bookshelf, my kitchen, showing the mug I'd left by the sink that morning, my bedroom, showing my unmade bed, the clothes on my chair, my bathroom, my desk with my laptop closed on it. They'd been inside again. While I was at work, while I was sitting in that call center reading scripts and taking calls, someone had been in my flat, walking through my rooms, photographing everything. The photos were dated from yesterday, the day before I found them, which meant they'd been inside while I was out. Uploaded the photos that same day, and I'd only just found them now. I looked at every photo carefully. In one of them, the one showing my living room, I could see my coffee table, and on it there was something that hadn't been there before. A piece of paper, white, A4 size, just sitting there in the center of the table. I walked to my living room. The paper was still there. I'd walked past it a dozen times since I'd been home and hadn't registered it. It looked like nothing, just a blank piece of paper. I picked it up. There was writing on one side, handwritten in blue pen, neat and careful. It was my address, my full address, my name, my date of birth, my phone number, my bank details, down to the sort code and account number, my email addresses, my passport number, everything about me, laid out in a neat list, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Underneath, a single sentence: "You should be more careful about your security." My legs felt weak. I sat down on the sofa, still holding the paper. Someone had been in my flat. Someone had gone through my things, found my documents, copied down my personal information, and left me this note. And then they'd photographed it all and uploaded it to that site. I looked at the photos again on my laptop. I zoomed in on the one showing the coffee table. The paper was visible, but the writing wasn't clear enough to read. Just a white rectangle sitting there. They'd taken the photo after leaving the note. They'd wanted me to find it. I thought about calling the police then. I should have called them weeks ago, but now I had proof. Someone had broken into my flat. I had the note. I had the photos. Surely that was enough. But what would the police do? The note wasn't threatening. It didn't say they'd hurt me or come back. It was just information. My information, yes, but nothing you couldn't find if you knew where to look. And the photos? They were on the dark web, yes, but uploaded anonymously from somewhere untraceable. What could the police actually do with any of this? I moved out the next week, broke my lease, paid whatever penalties the landlord wanted, and found a new flat across the city in Chorlton. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I changed my phone number. I closed my old email accounts and made new ones. I cancelled my bank cards and got new ones. I did everything I could think of to separate myself from that flat, that building, that whole situation. For a while it worked. I checked the dark website occasionally, maybe once every few weeks, and there were no new photos of my old building, no new folders with my postcode, nothing. I started to feel like I'd escaped it, like it was over. Then, about 8 months after I'd moved, I checked the site again. There was a new folder, new initials. I clicked on it without thinking. The photos loaded. My new flat, my new building, my new corridor, my new door. I slammed the laptop shut and haven't opened that site since. That was 3 years ago now. I moved again after that, obviously, and then again. I've lived in 4 different flats since then. I don't check the site anymore. I can't. I'm too frightened of what I'll find. The thing is, I don't know why they targeted me. I wasn't special. I wasn't wealthy or important or connected to anything interesting. I was just some nobody working in a call center, living alone, spending too much time online. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all it takes. I still think about those photos sometimes, all those flats, all those people, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all catalogued and organized and uploaded for anyone to see. And I wonder how many of them know, how many of them have found their own photos, their own buildings, their own doors. How many of them are living with the same knowledge I have, that someone was there, inside their private space, watching and recording and documenting their lives. I don't know who's doing it. I don't know why. And that's the worst part, really. Not knowing if it's one person or many. Not knowing if they're watching me right now, or if they moved on years ago. Not knowing if the photos are still there, accumulating, expanding, or if the whole site disappeared the day after I last looked at it. All I know is that I was careful with my security before, and I'm even more careful now. I check my logs twice. I take photos of my flat before I leave. I keep my documents locked away. I cover my laptop camera. I do everything you're supposed to do. But sometimes, when I come home from work and unlock my door, I get this feeling, this sense that something's different, that someone's been there while I was out. I'll stand in the doorway, looking at my flat, trying to work out what's changed. And usually, it's nothing. Just paranoia. Just my mind playing tricks. But sometimes, very occasionally, something will be slightly off. A drawer not quite closed. A chair at a different angle. Something small enough that I can't be certain, but noticeable enough that I can't quite dismiss it. And when that happens, I don't sleep properly for days. There's something unsettling about discovering that your intellectual curiosity can be turned into a weapon against you. When I first started reviewing books for what seemed like a legitimate publishing company, I thought I was finally using my literature degree for something worthwhile. I had no idea that my analytical skills were being harvested to improve surveillance techniques that would eventually be used on people just like me. The opportunity came at exactly the right moment, which should have made me more suspicious than it did. I had been unemployed for several months after my position at the local council was eliminated during budget cuts. The communications department where I worked had been decimated, and suddenly I found myself competing with candidates half my age for entry-level administrative positions that paid significantly less than what I had been earning. My savings had been depleted by months of unsuccessful job searching, and I was surviving on a combination of unemployment benefits and whatever freelance writing work I could find through online platforms. Most of these assignments involved creating generic content for websites at rates that barely covered my basic expenses, but I was grateful for any income that allowed me to maintain some semblance of independence. When the email arrived offering substantial payment for book reviews, it seemed like an answer to my financial problems. The company described themselves as a boutique publishing house that specialized in contemporary fiction, dealing with psychological themes. They needed experienced readers to provide detailed analysis of how different authors approached topics related to mental health, social isolation, and interpersonal relationships. The initial communication was professional and thorough, asking intelligent questions about my educational background and reading preferences. They seemed genuinely interested in my analytical capabilities and expressed appreciation for my academic training in literature. The work could be completed entirely from home on my own schedule, and they offered to pay nearly 10 times what I had been earning for typical freelance writing assignments. During our video interview, the representative appeared knowledgeable about contemporary literary trends and asked thoughtful questions about my approach to literary criticism. They explained that their research focused on understanding how fiction influences public attitudes toward mental health issues and social relationships. Their goal was to identify emerging themes in contemporary literature that might indicate broader cultural shifts in how people understand psychological distress and social connection. The first book they sent me was a recently published novel called The Quiet Tenant, which followed a woman who becomes increasingly convinced that her neighbors are conducting systematic surveillance of her daily activities. The story was expertly crafted, with realistic character development and a gradual progression from normal social anxiety to genuine paranoia that felt entirely believable. What struck me most about the book was the extraordinary attention to detail in describing surveillance techniques and psychological manipulation methods. The author seemed to have extensive knowledge of how modern technology could be used to monitor people without their awareness, and how this information could be leveraged to influence their behavior and emotional state. The review they requested was far more comprehensive than typical literary criticism. They wanted detailed analysis of the psychological techniques described in the narrative, assessment of how realistic the surveillance methods appeared to be, an evaluation of how effectively the author had portrayed the mental state of someone experiencing systematic monitoring and manipulation. They also requested specific information about which scenes had been most convincing or disturbing, which psychological tactics seem most plausible in real-world contexts, and how the book might affect readers who are already dealing with anxiety or paranoia about their personal safety and privacy. This level of analysis felt consistent with serious academic research about literature's social impact. Understanding how fictional portrayals of surveillance and manipulation might influence public perceptions of these issues would be valuable for publishers, mental health professionals, and researchers studying contemporary culture. I spent considerable time crafting a thorough review that addressed all their specific questions, while maintaining the analytical rigor I had developed during my university studies. The work was intellectually engaging in a way that my recent freelance assignments had not been, and I found myself genuinely excited about contributing to what seemed like meaningful literary research. Their response to my first review was enthusiastic and detailed, praising the depth of my analysis and the specificity of my observations. They immediately offered me a second book to review, this time a novel about a man who discovers that his online activities are being monitored and used to manipulate his real-world relationships and career prospects. The second book was even more technically sophisticated than the first, containing detailed descriptions of digital surveillance methods, data analysis techniques, and psychological profiling strategies that seemed far too accurate and specific for fictional speculation. The author demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of how personal information could be gathered from online activities and used to predict and influence behavior. Again, they requested extensive analysis focusing on the plausibility of the techniques described, the effectiveness of the psychological manipulation portrayed, and the potential impact on readers' attitudes toward online privacy and digital security. They seemed particularly interested in my assessment of which aspects of the surveillance described in the book were technically feasible with current technology. Over the following weeks, I reviewed approximately a dozen books, all dealing with variations on themes of surveillance, manipulation, and psychological control. The quality of writing varied significantly, but all contained remarkably detailed and realistic descriptions of how people could be monitored, analyzed, and manipulated without their knowledge or consent. Some books focused specifically on digital surveillance and online manipulation techniques, while others dealt with physical surveillance and real-world control methods. All presented these activities as systematic and organized operations carried out by people with significant resources and expertise in psychological manipulation. The reviews I was producing became increasingly technical and detailed as the company requested more specific analysis of the surveillance methods described, assessment of their effectiveness in different contexts, and evaluation of potential countermeasures that targets might use to protect themselves from these techniques. They also began asking for personal responses to the material I was reading, wanting to know which scenarios had made me feel most anxious or paranoid, which techniques seemed most threatening or invasive, and how the books had affected my own attitudes toward privacy and personal security. This expansion beyond literary analysis into personal psychological assessment should have concerned me more than it did, but the work remained fascinating and the compensation continued to be excellent. I convinced myself that understanding readers' emotional responses was a legitimate component of market research for psychological thriller novels. However, around the 6th week of this arrangement, I began noticing that many of the books I was reviewing contained scenarios and details that seemed remarkably similar to my own life circumstances. References to financial struggles, social isolation, and the specific type of freelance work I was doing appeared frequently across different books by different authors. Even more unsettling were the descriptions of surveillance techniques that seemed specifically tailored to someone in exactly my situation. The books contained detailed discussions of how financially vulnerable freelancers could be monitored and manipulated through the same platforms and methods I was using to find work. When I mentioned these similarities to my contact at the company, they explained that contemporary fiction often draws inspiration from current social and economic conditions. The prevalence of freelance work and financial insecurity in modern society meant that many authors were naturally exploring these themes in their writing. This explanation seemed reasonable enough, but I began paying closer attention to the specific details in the books I was reviewing. The surveillance methods described were often extremely specific and technically detailed, suggesting that the authors had access to genuine expertise in monitoring and manipulation techniques, rather than relying on general knowledge or imagination. Some books contained what amounted to step-by-step instructions for identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in people experiencing financial stress or social isolation. Others provided detailed guidance on using freelance work platforms to recruit unwitting participants in surveillance or manipulation activities. The level of technical detail in these descriptions far exceeded what would be necessary for fictional entertainment purposes. The books read more like instruction manuals than novels, providing comprehensive guidance on surveillance and manipulation techniques that happened to be embedded within narrative frameworks. Around the 8th week of my involvement with this project, the company began requesting additional services that went beyond basic book review work. They wanted me to research the authors of the books I had been reading, gathering information about their backgrounds, qualifications, and potential sources for the detailed technical knowledge their books contained. They also asked me to investigate whether the surveillance and manipulation techniques described in the books were being discussed in online communities or implemented by real people for actual surveillance activities. This research required accessing areas of the internet that were not easily discoverable through conventional search engines. The company provided detailed instructions for accessing private communities where people discussed surveillance techniques, manipulation methods, and psychological control strategies as practical skills rather than fictional concepts. They explained that understanding how fictional portrayals compared to real-world practices was important for their research into literary market trends and social impact. These online communities were unlike anything I had encountered in my previous internet activities. The participants discussed surveillance and manipulation as legitimate professional skills, sharing detailed techniques for monitoring people's activities, identifying psychological vulnerabilities, and exploiting those vulnerabilities for control or profit. Many of the techniques discussed in these communities were identical to methods described in the books I had been reviewing for the past 2 months. The fiction I had been analyzing was not imaginative speculation about surveillance and manipulation possibilities, but rather documentation of real techniques being actively used by organized groups to monitor and control vulnerable people. I began to understand that my book review work had been used to analyze and refine instruction materials for surveillance and manipulation activities. My detailed literary criticism had provided feedback on how effectively these techniques were being presented and how they might affect people who were being targeted by such methods. The company had been using my analytical skills to improve their training materials while simultaneously gathering detailed psychological information about how someone in my specific circumstances would respond to being systematically monitored and manipulated. I had become both the analyst and the test subject in their research program. When I attempted to end my involvement with the project, the company pointed out that I now possessed detailed knowledge of surveillance techniques and had gained access to communities where these methods were actively discussed and implemented. This information was too sensitive to allow me to simply walk away without ongoing security considerations. They also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal activities that they could not have gathered through our professional relationship alone. They made references to my daily routine, social interactions, and financial circumstances that suggested they had been implementing the surveillance techniques I had been reviewing and researching. The surveillance of my activities became increasingly obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my movements and communications were being monitored and documented. This was not threatening behavior in any direct sense, but it was comprehensive enough to make it clear that they possessed detailed knowledge of my circumstances and routine. I attempted to report my concerns to the police, but discovered that explaining the situation was nearly impossible within conventional frameworks of criminal activity. The book review work had been completely legitimate. The research into surveillance techniques could be justified as academic interest, and the ongoing contact could be explained as normal follow-up communication with a satisfied client. The books I had been reviewing were actual published novels available in bookshops and libraries throughout the country. The online communities I had researched were accessible to anyone who possessed the knowledge of where to look for them. Nothing I had been asked to do was obviously illegal or clearly threatening in isolation. However, the cumulative effect had been to draw me into detailed study of surveillance and manipulation techniques while simultaneously making me a target of those same techniques. The literary criticism work had been a sophisticated recruitment method disguised as legitimate freelance employment. The company continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering additional book review opportunities and occasionally sending subtle references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active and comprehensive. I never determined who the company actually represented or what they were ultimately using the book reviews and surveillance research to accomplish. The systematic study of manipulation techniques combined with practical implementation of those techniques against the researchers themselves suggested an organization that was both studying and actively practicing psychological control methods. What I do understand is that they had developed sophisticated methods for exploiting people's intellectual curiosity and financial desperation to recruit unwitting participants in research designed to improve their own surveillance and manipulation capabilities. They understood how to present criminal intelligence gathering as legitimate academic work while using the researchers as test subjects for the techniques being studied. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how the work had been presented as literary analysis, when it was actually intelligence gathering and technique refinement, conducted on both the material and the analyst simultaneously. I had been providing detailed feedback on instruction materials while serving as a test subject for the techniques those materials described. I continue to receive occasional contact attempts from similar literary research companies offering book review work that pays unusually well for the apparent simplicity of the assignments. The books they want reviewed always deal with psychological themes. The analysis they request is always unusually detailed and technical, and the research they suggest always leads toward communities discussing surveillance and manipulation techniques. I decline these offers immediately now, but I often wonder how many other readers and writers have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate literary criticism, while actually participating in the development and refinement of psychological control methods that will eventually be used against people just like themselves. You know how sometimes you lose touch with people and wonder what happened to them? Well, I found out what happened to my old flatmate, and I really wish I hadn't. I was trying to find someone who could make me a fake ID. Nothing serious, just something that would get me into pubs without having to carry my passport around Manchester. My real driving license had been stolen along with my wallet, and getting a replacement was taking weeks because of some bureaucratic nonsense with DVLA. Someone at uni had mentioned there were places online where you could get decent fake documents made. So I spent a few evenings browsing hidden sites that specialized in that sort of thing. Most were obvious scams, asking for hundreds of pounds up front. But eventually, I found what looked like a legitimate service run by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The site was simple but professional. Examples of their work, pricing for different types of documents, even customer reviews that seemed genuine. What caught my attention was that they offered to meet clients in person for document handovers, which seemed safer than trusting the post with something like a fake ID. The person running the operation called themselves Dockmaster and claimed to be based in the Northwest. When I sent an inquiry about getting a driving license made, they responded quickly with details about their process and pricing. About £80 for a basic fake that would pass casual inspection. More if you wanted something that could fool professional scrutiny. But it was the photograph on their profile page that made me do a double take. The image showed someone's hands holding a newly printed driving license, demonstrating the quality of their work. But I recognized the hands immediately. The scar across the knuckles from when Jake had punched the window during Freshers Week. The distinctive silver ring he always wore on his middle finger. Jake had been my flatmate for 8 months before he vanished. He was studying business at Manchester Met, was always short of money, and was constantly looking for ways to make quick cash without having to get a proper job. He'd tried everything from selling energy drinks at raves to offering essay writing services to international students. Then one day in February, he'd simply disappeared. Left his room exactly as it was, didn't take any clothes or personal belongings, just stopped coming home. His phone went straight to voicemail. His university login hadn't been used, and his bank account showed no activity after the day he vanished. I'd reported him missing after a week, but the police weren't particularly interested. Young men disappeared from shared accommodation all the time, they said. Usually it was drugs, or debt, or family problems they didn't want to discuss. Most of them turned up eventually, living rough, or staying with friends they hadn't told anyone about. But Jake hadn't seemed like someone who would run away from problems. He was actually quite sensible about money and relationships, never got involved with anything too risky or illegal. The sudden disappearance was completely out of character for someone who usually overthought every decision. Now I was looking at what appeared to be his hands in a photograph advertising illegal document services. Either he was alive and working as a forger, or someone else was using his identity to run a criminal operation. I decided to place an order with Dogmaster to see if I could learn more about who was really behind the service. I submitted my photograph and personal details, explaining that I needed the document quickly and was willing to meet in person to collect it. The response came back within hours, professional and businesslike. They could have the license ready within 3 days, and we could arrange to meet at a location in Manchester city centre. The handover would take place in a public area. They suggested the food court at the Arndale Centre during busy periods when there would be plenty of people around. What struck me was the writing style. The messages were formatted in exactly the same way Jake used to write emails, short paragraphs, specific punctuation habits, even the same tendency to over-explain simple instructions. If this wasn't Jake himself, it was someone who had studied his communication patterns very carefully. I agreed to the meeting and waited for further instructions about the exact time and location. Part of me hoped it would actually be Jake, that he'd somehow gotten involved with document forgery and would have a reasonable explanation for why he'd disappeared so suddenly. But another part of me worried that someone else was using his identity for reasons I didn't want to think about. The final message about the meeting contained details that convinced me this really was Jake. The suggested meeting point was a specific bench near the Waterstones in the Arndale Centre, the exact same spot where we'd arranged to meet during Freshers' Week when he was helping me find accommodation. Nobody else would have known that location was significant to us. But if Jake was alive and operating as a document forger, why hadn't he contacted any of his friends or family? Why had he left all his possessions behind and allowed people to think he might be dead? And how had he acquired the skills and equipment needed to produce professional quality fake documents? I started researching what was involved in document forgery, trying to understand what kind of operation Jake might have gotten himself involved with. It wasn't just a matter of having a good printer and some cardstock. Producing convincing fake IDs required specialized equipment, access to security features, and knowledge of exactly how legitimate documents were constructed. Such a setup would cost thousands of pounds and take months to establish properly. This was not something a cash-strapped student could assemble independently, even if he possessed the technical knowledge. That suggested Jake was working for someone else, possibly someone who had recruited him for his clean background and lack of obvious criminal connections. Young men without records were valuable for operations that needed to maintain a legitimate front while conducting illegal business. But it also raised darker possibilities. Maybe Jake hadn't chosen to disappear at all. Maybe he'd been recruited against his will, or coerced into participating through threats against his family or friends. The document forgery operation might be just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that used missing persons as expendable workers. I tried to investigate potential connections between missing person cases, specifically seeking young men who had vanished from university accommodation under comparable circumstances. What I found was disturbing. Dozens of cases across different cities, all involving students who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind personal belongings and active social lives. Most of these cases had received minimal police attention, classified as voluntary disappearances unless there was evidence of violence or coercion. The missing persons were usually described as having financial problems or academic struggles that might motivate them to start fresh elsewhere. But the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone was systematically targeting vulnerable students, making them disappear in ways that wouldn't trigger serious investigations, and at least some of them were probably being forced to work in illegal operations like the document forgery service I discovered. The day of the meeting arrived, and I positioned myself in the Arndale Centre early to observe the area around the designated meeting point. I wanted to see who showed up and whether they appeared to be working alone or as part of a larger group. At exactly the agreed time, someone approached the bench where we were supposed to meet. From a distance, it looked like Jake. Same height and build, similar clothing style, even the same way of walking that I'd observed during the months we'd shared accommodation. But when he got closer, I could see that something was wrong. His appearance was different in subtle ways. Hair cut shorter than he used to wear it, weight loss that made his face look gaunt, an overall demeanor that seemed more cautious and nervous than the confident person I remembered. Most disturbing was the way he kept checking his surroundings, constantly scanning the crowd as if he was expecting trouble or watching for specific people. This wasn't someone meeting a client for a routine business transaction. It was someone who felt threatened and was taking precautions against unknown dangers. I watched from across the food court as Jake waited for nearly 20 minutes, checking his phone repeatedly and growing increasingly agitated when nobody approached him. Eventually, he got up and walked away, moving quickly through the crowd toward one of the center's exits. I followed at a distance, trying to see where he was going without getting close enough to be noticed. He moved through the building like someone who knew exactly where the security cameras were positioned, taking routes that kept him out of direct surveillance as much as possible. Outside the Arndale Centre, Jake headed toward the northern quarter, walking quickly and continuing to check behind him every few minutes. I stayed as far back as I could while keeping him in sight, but the streets were busy enough that following someone without being noticed was relatively easy. He led me to a small internet cafe on a side street, the kind of place that catered to people who needed anonymous online access. Through the window, I could see him settling at a computer terminal in the back corner, positioned so he could watch both the entrance and the street outside. I waited across the street for about an hour, watching the internet cafe and noting who else came and went. Most of the customers seemed to be using the place for legitimate purposes. Tourists checking email, students working on assignments, people who didn't have reliable internet access at home. But there were also a few individuals who behaved differently, using the computers for short periods and paying in cash before leaving quickly. People who seemed more concerned with anonymity than convenience, possibly conducting business they didn't want, traced back to their normal internet connections. When Jake finally emerged from the internet cafe, he looked even more nervous than before. He spent several minutes standing in the doorway, scanning the street carefully before stepping outside. Then he walked quickly toward the tram station, moving like someone who needed to get away from the area as soon as possible. I decided not to follow him any further. If Jake was involved with people who made him this paranoid about surveillance, getting too close might put both of us in danger. Instead, I went into the internet cafe to see if I could learn anything about what he'd been doing during his visit. The manager was helpful when I explained that I was trying to locate a friend who might have been using their services. He couldn't provide specific details about what customers did online, but he confirmed that the person I described was a regular visitor who always paid cash and never stayed for more than an hour at a time. More interestingly, he mentioned that this customer always used the same computer terminal, the one in the back corner that Jake had chosen. That terminal was popular with people who valued privacy because it was positioned away from the main seating area and had additional software installed that provided better anonymity protection. This setup would be particularly useful for someone conducting illegal business online, such as running a document forgery service through dark web marketplaces. I tried contacting Dockmaster again through the original website, explaining that I'd been unable to attend the meeting due to unexpected circumstances. I asked if we could reschedule, hoping to get another chance to make contact with Jake in a safer environment. But this time, there was no response. The website remained active, still advertising document services and accepting new orders, but my messages to Dockmaster went unanswered. Either Jake had recognized me at the meeting and realized his cover was blown, or something had happened to prevent him from continuing to operate the service. Over the next few weeks, I kept monitoring the website to see if there were any changes or updates. The service remained available, but the response times for customer inquiries became longer and more inconsistent. Eventually, new orders stopped being accepted entirely, and the site displayed a message saying the service was temporarily unavailable due to technical difficulties. I tried visiting the internet cafe again, hoping to catch Jake during one of his regular sessions, but the manager said he hadn't seen him since the day I'd followed him there. Either he'd found a different location for his online activities, or he'd stopped using the service entirely. The most disturbing possibility was that Jake's employers had discovered his identity had been compromised and had decided to eliminate the security risk. People involved in serious criminal operations didn't usually tolerate workers who attracted unwanted attention, especially when those workers were supposed to be untraceable missing persons. I considered reporting what I'd discovered to the police, but explaining how I'd found Jake would require admitting to browsing illegal websites and attempting to purchase forged documents. And without concrete evidence that he was being held against his will, they might not take the information seriously. People often assumed that young men who disappeared and later turned up working in illegal operations had chosen that path voluntarily. Proving coercion or trafficking would require more evidence than just recognizing someone's hands in a photograph on a criminal website. I started monitoring missing person databases more systematically, looking for other cases that might be connected to the document forgery operation or similar criminal services. What I found suggested that Jake's situation wasn't unique. There were dozens of young men who had disappeared from universities and later been spotted in circumstances that suggested involvement with illegal activities. However, the majority of these sightings were brief and inconclusive. People thought they'd seen missing persons in different cities, working in shops or restaurants, but the individuals had disappeared again before any contact could be made, as if someone was systematically moving them around to prevent them from being tracked down by friends or family. The document forgery website eventually went offline entirely, replaced by an error message claiming the domain had expired. But similar services continued to operate on other sites, offering the same types of illegal documents with the same professional quality and customer service standards. I sometimes wonder if Jake is still out there somewhere, working for people who use missing persons as expendable labor in criminal operations, whether he chose to disappear or was forced into it, and whether he has any way of escaping from whatever situation he's gotten trapped in. The worst part is knowing that there are probably dozens of other families wondering what happened to their missing sons and brothers, never realizing that their loved ones might be alive, but unable to make contact because they're being held by people who profit from making inconvenient individuals disappear. People who understand that a missing person presumed dead is much more valuable than a living person who might eventually find a way to ask for help. My daughter's face appeared on a website I should never have been able to find, and discovering why it was there has made me question every interaction I've had over the past year. I'm still not sure how much of what happened was random and how much was deliberately orchestrated, but I know I played a part in something I'll never be able to make right. I should explain that I'm a single mother living in Southampton. My daughter, Emma, is 7 years old, bright and cheerful. The sort of child who makes friends easily and trusts people instinctively. After her father and I separated 3 years ago, I've done my best to maintain some stability in her life whilst managing work and childcare on my own. I work as a dental receptionist, regular hours that usually align well with school times, though the gaps in coverage have always been a challenge. Last spring, a woman named Caroline approached me in the school playground during pickup. She introduced herself as another parent and said she'd noticed I often seemed rushed during the afternoon collection. She mentioned that she ran a small child-minding service from her home. Nothing official or registered, just helping out a few working parents who needed flexible coverage. She could collect Emma from school on days when I was running late and keep her for an hour or two until I finished work. Caroline seemed genuine enough. She was well-dressed, articulate, and knew several of the other parents by name. She showed me photos of her own children on her phone, a boy around Emma's age and a younger girl. Her house was within walking distance of the school, and the rates she quoted were significantly cheaper than the after-school club I'd been struggling to afford. I should have done more research, should have asked for references or checked her credentials properly, but I was exhausted from managing everything alone, and the offer seemed like a practical solution to a persistent problem. We arranged a trial period where Caroline would collect Emma twice a week, on days when my schedule at the dental practice ran later than usual. Emma took to her immediately. She'd come home full of stories about the crafts they'd done, or the games Caroline had taught her. Caroline would send me photos throughout the afternoon, showing Emma playing happily with her children, which was reassuring. Everything seemed to be working exactly as promised. After a few weeks, Caroline mentioned that she sometimes took the children to a local community centre on Wednesday afternoons. They ran various activities for young children, art classes and sports sessions, that sort of thing. She asked if I'd be comfortable with Emma attending these outings as part of the childminding arrangement. I agreed, pleased that Emma would have access to activities I couldn't afford to arrange myself. The Wednesday outings became a regular part of Emma's routine. She'd come home excited about the painting she'd done or the obstacle course she'd completed. Caroline always provided detailed updates about what they'd done, which activities Emma had particularly enjoyed, how she'd interacted with the other children. It all seemed perfectly normal and beneficial for Emma's development. Around 2 months into this arrangement, I received an email from what appeared to be the community centre's administration. It thanked me for enrolling Emma in their program and included an attachment with photos from recent sessions. The email explained that they documented all activities for safeguarding purposes, and parents could download images of their children participating. I opened the attachment and found around 20 photos of Emma at various activities. Painting at an easel, playing with building blocks, running through an obstacle course. She looked happy and engaged in all of them, exactly as Caroline had described. I saved a few of my favorites and didn't think much more about it. The following week, I received another email with more photos, then another the week after that. The frequency seemed excessive for a small community centre program, but I assumed they were just thorough about documentation. Emma appeared in most of the photos, sometimes with other children, sometimes on her own. The quality was professional, better than I'd expect from staff members casually documenting activities. It was Emma's teacher who first made me question the arrangement. She mentioned during Parents' Evening that Emma had been talking about her Wednesday activities with Caroline. The teacher seemed slightly concerned, asking whether I'd verified that Caroline was properly qualified and insured for childminding. I admitted I hadn't done formal checks, and the teacher suggested I should, particularly if Emma was being taken to venues outside Caroline's home. That conversation planted a seed of doubt. When I got home, I tried to search for information about Caroline's childminding service online. I found nothing. No website, no business registration, no reviews or recommendations. I searched for the community center she'd mentioned and couldn't find any facility by that name in our area. I called Caroline the next day to ask for more details about where exactly she was taking Emma. She seemed surprised by the question, slightly defensive even. She gave me an address for the community center and assured me it was a perfectly legitimate facility run by volunteers. When I searched for that address, I found it was actually a private residence, not a community facility at all. That's when I started to panic. I'd been allowing a woman I barely knew to take my daughter to an unknown location every week for 2 months. I'd received professional photographs of Emma that supposedly came from a community center that didn't exist, and I had no idea what was actually happening during those Wednesday afternoons. I confronted Caroline at school pickup that day, asking her directly what was going on. She became evasive, claiming there must have been some confusion about the address, that the community center operated from various locations. When I pressed her for specifics, she simply said she couldn't continue the childminding arrangement and walked away. I never saw her at the school again after that day. I reported everything to the school immediately. They had no record of any parent named Caroline with children at the school. The photos she'd shown me of her supposed children weren't in any of their class photographs. She'd been approaching parents outside the school gates for months, presenting herself as another parent, but no one knew who she actually was or where she'd come from. The police took my statement and began investigating. They asked for copies of all the photos I'd received and details of every interaction I'd had with Caroline. They seemed particularly concerned about the professional quality of the photographs and the fact that they'd been sent to me through email rather than being available through any official channels. What they discovered made me feel physically sick. The photos hadn't come from any community center. They'd been taken at a private address in Portsmouth, a house owned by someone with previous convictions for child exploitation offences. The property had been set up to look like a children's activity space, complete with toys, craft supplies, and play equipment, specifically for photographing children whose parents thought they were attending legitimate programs. Caroline wasn't her real name, and she'd been operating this scheme across multiple schools in the region for over a year. She'd approach single parents who seemed overwhelmed, offer affordable childminding services, gain trust over several weeks, and then introduce the supposed community center activities. The children were never harmed physically, but they were photographed extensively in various activities and settings. The photos were then sold on the dark web, marketed as candid images of children engaged in innocent activities. The clients who purchased them weren't looking for explicit content, at least not initially. They wanted authentic photographs of real children in everyday situations, images that appeared natural and unstaged. The prices varied based on the child's appearance and how many different activity sets had been photographed. The police showed me the website where Emma's photos had been listed. I had to access it through their systems, since it wasn't available through normal internet browsing. The site was organized like a stock photography service, with categories for different activities and age groups. Emma's photos were catalogued under multiple categories: arts and crafts, outdoor play, educational activities. Each photo had been viewed hundreds of times, and several complete sets had been purchased. What made it worse was realizing the emails I'd received weren't all the photos that existed. Those were just samples, proof that the child in the listings was real and that new content was being regularly produced. The full collections were much larger, containing images from angles I'd never seen, showing Emma in situations I hadn't been told about. Close-ups of her face, shots that focused on specific aspects of her appearance, carefully composed photographs that had obviously been taken by someone with experience in this particular type of content. The investigation revealed that Caroline worked with several other people who performed different roles in the operation. Someone else owned the property where the photos were taken. Another person managed the website and handled client communications. Caroline's specific role was recruitment, identifying potential targets and building enough trust to gain regular access to the children. They'd refined the approach over time, learning which parents were most vulnerable to the offer of affordable childminding. Single parents, particularly mothers who were juggling work and childcare alone, were ideal targets. The promise of flexibility and low cost made it difficult to refuse, and the gradual introduction of the community center activities made the whole thing seem like a genuine enrichment opportunity for the children. Emma was one of 7 children who'd been photographed at that property over the past year. The others belonged to parents in similar situations, all of whom thought their children were attending legitimate activities. None of us had checked Caroline's credentials properly. None of us had visited the supposed community center. We'd all been too grateful for affordable help to ask the difficult questions we should have asked. The police arrested 4 people in connection with the operation. Caroline, whose real name was Sarah and who had no children of her own, received a prison sentence for child exploitation and fraud. The property owner received a longer sentence due to his previous convictions. The others involved received various punishments, though the sentences seemed inadequate given what they'd done. The website was shut down, but the police confirmed the photos had been downloaded by numerous clients before they could seize the servers. Emma's images, along with those of the other children, were almost certainly saved on private devices and potentially redistributed through other platforms. Once digital content exists, removing every copy becomes nearly impossible. I had to explain to Emma why she couldn't see Caroline anymore, why the police needed to ask her questions about the Wednesday activities. She didn't understand what had happened, couldn't grasp why the fun afternoons she'd enjoyed were actually something sinister. She just knew that something had changed and that I seemed upset whenever the subject came up. The hardest part was dealing with my own guilt. I'd handed my daughter over to a stranger because it was convenient and affordable. I'd accepted vague explanations about community centers without verifying any details. I'd received professional photographs of my child and never questioned why a casual child-minding arrangement would involve such high-quality documentation. I kept thinking about all the small warning signs I'd ignored or rationalized away. The way Caroline always seemed to be free whenever I needed help, as though she had no other commitments. The fact that I'd never seen her children, only photos she'd shown me. The absence of any online presence for her supposed child-minding service. The detailed updates she provided after each session, which I now understood, were designed to prevent me from asking Emma too many questions about what she'd actually been doing. The other parents whose children had been involved were dealing with their own versions of the same guilt and horror. We formed a strange sort of support group, united by our shared experience of being manipulated and our children being exploited. None of us had been negligent in any legal sense, but we all felt responsible for having trusted the wrong person. I moved Emma to a different school the following term. The old school held too many associations with Caroline and the playground where she'd first approached me. The new school has strict policies about who can collect children, requiring formal authorization and identification checks for anyone who isn't a parent. They were understanding about our situation when I explained why I needed those extra safeguards in place. I still receive occasional notifications from the police about the ongoing investigation. They're trying to identify and locate everyone who purchased photos from that website, though they've admitted it's nearly impossible given the nature of dark web transactions. They've managed to identify some clients in the UK, but many were overseas, beyond the reach of British law enforcement. Sometimes I search for Emma's name online, checking if any of those photos have surfaced in public spaces. I've never found anything, which should be reassuring, but isn't really. I know the photos exist somewhere, in private collections and hidden corners of the internet I can't access. I know that somewhere, people who purchased those images are still looking at them, and there's nothing I can do about it. Emma is 9 now, seemingly unaffected by what happened. She doesn't remember much about those Wednesday afternoons, just that they were fun, and that she's confused about why she can't see Caroline anymore. I haven't told her the full truth about what those activities were actually for. I don't know if I ever will, or if it's better to let her remember them as the innocent afternoons she thought they were. But I remember every photo I received, every email that thanked me for enrolling Emma in a program that didn't exist. I remember Caroline's friendly smile in the playground, and how relieved I felt when she first offered to help. I remember thinking I'd found the perfect solution to my childcare problems, never imagining I was actually handing my daughter to someone who saw her as content to be produced and sold. The guilt doesn't fade. 2 years later, I still question every decision I make regarding Emma's care. I'm hypervigilant about who she spends time with, to the point where it probably affects her social development. I can't bring myself to use childminders or after-school clubs, even legitimate registered services with proper credentials. I've reduced my working hours so I can always do the school pickup myself. Even though the financial strain is significant, I've learned that the dark web isn't just a place where illegal goods are traded. It's where ordinary moments from children's lives can be commodified and sold to people whose interest in those moments is anything but ordinary. It's where professional-looking websites can exist without any oversight, hosting content that shouldn't exist at all. And it's where photos of my daughter, taken during afternoons I thought were enriching her life, continue to circulate in spaces I'll never be able to access or control. The police kept telling me I wasn't at fault, that the operation was sophisticated and deliberately targeted vulnerable parents. But I know I could have been more careful. I could have checked Caroline's credentials properly. I could have visited the supposed community center before allowing Emma to go there. I could have asked more questions when something seemed too good to be true. Instead, I was grateful for help and tired from managing everything alone, and someone exploited that vulnerability in a way I never saw coming. That's what keeps me awake now. Not just what happened to Emma, but what might be happening to other children whose parents are facing the same struggles I was. How many other single mothers are being approached in school playgrounds right now by people claiming to offer affordable childminding? How many are accepting out of desperation, never suspecting what those services actually involve? I wanted to warn other parents, to share my story as a cautionary tale about checking credentials and trusting instincts. But doing so means admitting publicly what happened potentially exposing Emma to questions and judgment she doesn't deserve. So instead, I remain silent, carrying this knowledge alone, hoping that somehow my mistake won't be repeated by others who find themselves in similar circumstances. The photos exist. The website was replicated before it was shut down, probably multiple times, preserving all the content for anyone who wants to access it. Emma's face is out there in those hidden corners of the internet, tagged and categorized, available to people I'll never identify. And there's absolutely nothing I can do except hope that one day, somehow, all traces of those images will disappear. But I know they won't. Digital content is permanent, especially when it exists in spaces designed to preserve what mainstream internet would delete. That's the reality I live with now. Not the dramatic horror of immediate danger, but the quiet, persistent horror of knowing something irreversible happened and that my daughter's childhood innocence was documented and distributed for purposes I can barely stand to think about. All because I accepted help from someone whose friendliness masked something much darker, and I didn't ask the right questions until it was far too late. I needed some extra money while I was at university, so I started tutoring kids online. At the time, it seemed harmless enough. Being a student in London meant living on about £20 a week after rent and bills. So when I saw an advert for online tutoring that paid £15 an hour, I jumped at it. I was studying English literature at King's College, decent enough grades, and I'd always been good at explaining things to people. It appeared to be an easy way for me to earn money while working from my cramped dorm room. The website looked professional. Clean design, proper company registration details, even testimonials from parents talking about how much their children's grades had improved. They specialized in one-to-one tutoring for secondary school students who were struggling with English, history, and similar subjects. Nothing that required specialized qualifications, just patience and the ability to help teenagers understand their coursework. The application process was straightforward enough. I submitted my university details, uploaded copies of my A-level certificates, wrote a brief explanation of why I wanted to tutor students. Within a couple of days, I got an email saying I'd been accepted and could start taking on pupils immediately. The system worked through video calls scheduled at times that suited both the student and tutor. Parents would book sessions through the website, pay in advance, and the company would take a small commission while passing the majority of the fee directly to the tutor. Everything seemed legitimate and well organized. My first few students were exactly what I'd expected. Teenagers from middle-class families whose parents were worried about their GCSE results. Most of the students were pleasant, but they were having difficulties with essay writing and literary analysis. The sessions went well, and I started getting positive feedback from both students and their parents. But after a few weeks, I began noticing some odd things about the platform. The technical setup was more sophisticated than it needed to be for simple tutoring sessions. The video calling software had features I'd never seen before. Multiple camera angles, audio recording capabilities, even options for screen sharing that seemed designed for much more complex interactions than homework help. More concerning was the level of security around the sessions. Students and tutors were both required to use specific software that could only be downloaded from the company's website. The program included identity verification features that took photographs during each session, supposedly to ensure that the registered tutor was actually the person conducting the lesson. But the software also monitored much more than that. It tracked everything happening on my computer during sessions, which programs were running, what websites I had open, even how I was interacting with the tutoring platform. When I asked the support team about this, they said it was standard security practice to prevent fraud and ensure the quality of their educational services. The students I was assigned also seemed carefully selected in ways that didn't quite make sense for a random tutoring service. They were all roughly the same age, around 14 or 15, and came from similar backgrounds, well-spoken, articulate, from families that clearly had money, but weren't necessarily academic high achievers. What struck me as particularly odd was that none of them seemed to have friends or siblings who might also benefit from tutoring. Usually, if a service worked well for one child in a family, parents would recommend it to other families or sign up additional children. But every student I worked with appeared to be an only child from a household where tutoring was treated as a very private arrangement. The sessions themselves were also structured differently than I'd expected. Rather than focusing purely on academic subjects, there was always a significant amount of general conversation. Students were encouraged to talk about their daily routines, their family life, their interests and hobbies. The company's training materials emphasized the importance of building rapport and understanding each student's personal circumstances. Initially, I thought this was just good educational practice. Understanding a student's background helps you tailor your teaching approach. But gradually, I realized the conversations were following very specific patterns, with students being guided to reveal detailed information about their home lives, family relationships, and daily schedules. The company provided detailed session reports that tutors were required to complete after each lesson. These reports included not just academic progress, but comprehensive notes about what the student had discussed regarding their personal life, where they lived, what their parents did for work, what activities they participated in outside school, even details about family holidays and social events. When I questioned why this level of personal information was necessary for tutoring sessions, the company explained that they were building comprehensive learner profiles to help match students with the most suitable educational approaches. Understanding a child's complete circumstances allowed them to provide more effective support and identify potential barriers to academic success. But the more sessions I conducted, the more uncomfortable I became with the amount of personal information I was gathering about these teenagers. Some of them were incredibly open about details that seemed far too private to be relevant to their education. Family arguments, financial problems, even information about when their parents would be away from home. I started paying closer attention to the other tutors working for the platform, trying to understand whether they were having similar experiences. The company had a private discussion area where tutors could share teaching tips and support each other. But most of the conversations felt oddly scripted and superficial. When I tried asking direct questions about the personal information requirements or the unusual technical setup, other tutors either didn't respond or gave answers that sounded like they were reading from company training materials. Nobody seemed willing to discuss any concerns about the platform's practices or policies. That's when I started looking more carefully at the company itself. The business registration details were legitimate, but when I tried researching the company's history and background, I found very little information. They claimed to have been operating for several years and to work with hundreds of families, but there was almost no online presence beyond their official website. More troubling was the discovery that the company was registered as providing educational consulting and family support services, rather than simple tutoring. The business description suggested they offered much more comprehensive services than just academic support, including what they called youth development programs and family liaison services. When I searched for these broader service categories, I found connections to organizations that specialized in working with vulnerable young people. Some appeared to be legitimate charities and social services, but others were more difficult to categorize. Companies that offered intervention services and family mediation without clearly explaining what those services actually involved. The most disturbing discovery was that some of the families using the tutoring service weren't paying the fees themselves. Instead, payments were being made by third-party organizations that seemed to specialize in providing support to families going through difficult circumstances. Social services departments, family courts, and even seemingly private investigators were involved. I tried accessing some of the session recordings to review what information I'd actually been collecting from students. The company claimed that all sessions were recorded for quality assurance purposes, and tutors were supposed to be able to access their own recordings for professional development. But when I logged into the system, I discovered that the recordings contained much more than just the video calls I'd been conducting. The software had been capturing audio from my computer's microphone throughout entire sessions, including conversations I'd had with flatmates and phone calls I'd made while the tutoring program was running in the background. Even more concerning was evidence that the program had been accessing my computer's camera and microphone outside of scheduled tutoring sessions. There were recordings of me in my room when I thought I was completely private, captured during times when I hadn't been logged into the tutoring platform at all. The company had essentially turned every tutor's computer into a surveillance device, monitoring our personal lives as comprehensively as we were monitoring the students we were supposed to be helping. I immediately stopped conducting sessions and tried to uninstall the tutoring software from my computer. But the program had embedded itself much more deeply into my system than a simple application should have been able to do. Even after following the official uninstallation process, I could see that components of the software were still running and potentially still monitoring my activities. When I contacted the company to demand an explanation and request immediate termination of my account, I received an automated response explaining that tutors were required to give 30 days notice before ending their contracts. During this notice period, they would remain responsible for any students they'd been working with and would need to complete detailed handover reports for each pupil. The handover reports required comprehensive summaries of everything I'd learned about each student's personal circumstances, family background, and daily routine. Essentially, the company required me to compile detailed profiles for whoever would take over their educational support. I refused to complete the handover reports and demanded immediate account closure. But the company's response was much more threatening than I'd expected. They reminded me that I'd signed detailed contracts when joining their platform, including clauses about confidentiality and data protection responsibilities. More specifically, they pointed out that I now had access to sensitive information about multiple minors and their families. If this information was misused or disclosed inappropriately, there could be serious legal consequences for everyone involved. The company had a responsibility to ensure that all personal data collected through their platform was handled properly and securely. The implication was clear. If I tried to expose what I discovered about their operations, they would claim I was violating the privacy of the children I'd been tutoring. The families who trusted me with information about their personal lives could potentially take legal action if they discovered I'd been sharing details about their circumstances with unauthorized parties. I was trapped by the same surveillance system I'd been unknowingly helping to operate. I tried researching what had happened to other tutors who'd worked for the platform, looking for anyone who might have spoken publicly about similar experiences. But I could find almost no trace of former employees or any discussions about the company's practices beyond their official marketing materials. Either previous tutors had been convinced to stay quiet through similar threats, or something had happened to prevent them from sharing their experiences. the few references I could find to people who'd worked for the company suggested they'd simply moved on to other jobs without making any public statements about their time as tutors. The most disturbing possibility was that the tutoring service was just the visible front for a much larger operation, that the detailed personal information being gathered about students and their families was being used for purposes that had nothing to do with education. Young people from wealthy families would be valuable targets for various types of criminal activity: kidnapping, burglary, identity theft, or even more sophisticated fraud schemes that required detailed knowledge of family circumstances and routines. The company had found a way to systematically gather intelligence about potential victims while maintaining complete legitimacy. Parents were voluntarily paying for a service that gave strangers comprehensive access to their children and detailed information about their family lives. And the tutors, like me, were unknowingly collecting the information that made these families vulnerable to whatever the company's real clients had planned for them. I still don't know what happened to the students I was tutoring or whether their families ever realized what kind of information they'd been sharing. The tutoring platform is still operating, still recruiting new tutors and signing up new families who think they're just getting help with their children's education. But I've never been able to completely remove their surveillance software from my computer. Sometimes I catch glimpses of processes running that shouldn't be there, or notice that my microphone has been active when I haven't been using any applications that should require it. The company claimed they'd closed my account and deleted all associated data, but I suspect they're still monitoring my activities, making sure I don't try to warn potential victims or expose what I discovered about their operations. After all, I now know exactly how their system works and what kind of information they're really collecting. That makes me either a valuable asset or a dangerous liability, depending on whether they think I can be trusted to stay quiet. And given what I've learned about how they operate, I'm not sure which category is more frightening to be placed in. Do you ever rehearse something in your head before you say it, just to get an idea of how it'll sound? I did that with this story. It probably sounds like a strange way to begin, but there's a reason. I can't bring myself to properly clean my own house anymore. Every time I pick up a cloth or switch on the Hoover, I think about the things I found hidden inside other people's homes, and I start to wonder what might be buried in mine. What seemed like straightforward work ended up showing me how fragile privacy really is. The whole thing started when I answered an advertisement for domestic cleaning work in Stoke-on-Trent. I had been struggling to find steady employment after the care home where I worked closed down due to funding issues. The redundancy package had barely lasted 2 months, and I was facing the prospect of losing my flat if I couldn't find regular income soon. The cleaning job seemed ideal for my circumstances. The agency advertised flexible hours, above average pay, and the opportunity to work independently without constant supervision. They emphasized that they served a discerning clientele who valued discretion and reliability above all else. During the interview, the agency manager explained that their clients were typically busy professionals who traveled frequently for work. Many of their properties required maintenance cleaning while the owners were abroad, ensuring that homes remained pristine and secure during extended absences. The manager stressed that absolute discretion was essential for this type of work. Clients needed to trust that their homes would be treated with complete respect, and that any personal information encountered during cleaning would remain strictly confidential. She made it clear that discussing clients or their homes with anyone outside the agency would result in immediate termination. I was assigned to a rotation of about 6 different properties across Staffordshire and the West Midlands. All were substantial homes owned by people who apparently traveled extensively for business. The agency provided detailed cleaning schedules and specific instructions for each property, along with keys and alarm codes for access. The first few properties I cleaned were exactly as advertised. Well-maintained homes that showed signs of recent occupation, but were temporarily vacant while the owners traveled. The cleaning work was thorough but straightforward, focusing on maintaining the properties in pristine condition for the owner's return. However, I began noticing unusual aspects of these homes that didn't quite fit the profile of busy traveling professionals. Many contained personal belongings and living arrangements that suggested the owners had left suddenly rather than departing for planned business trips. Some properties had half-eaten meals still on tables, unopened mail accumulating by the front door, and cars parked in driveways that appeared to have been sitting unused for weeks. The homes felt abandoned rather than temporarily vacant, as if the occupants had simply vanished without making proper arrangements for their absence. When I mentioned these observations to the agency manager, she explained that many of their clients worked in high-stress industries where travel plans could change rapidly. Emergency business trips often required immediate departure, leaving little time for proper household arrangements. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for the apparent haste with which some clients had departed their homes. International business often involved urgent situations that required dropping everything to respond to crises or opportunities abroad. However, as I continued working for the agency, I noticed that the cleaning assignments involved tasks that went beyond typical domestic maintenance. I was asked to organize personal documents, inventory valuable items, and photograph certain rooms and belongings for what the agency described as insurance and security purposes. These additional responsibilities felt intrusive and unnecessary for basic cleaning services. When I questioned why document organization and property photography were required, the agency explained that their clients often needed assistance managing their affairs during extended absences. Many clients were elderly or had complex financial arrangements that required careful monitoring, while they were unable to oversee their properties personally. The agency provided comprehensive property management services that went beyond simple cleaning to include basic administrative support. This explanation seemed plausible for legitimate property management work, but the specific documents and items I was asked to photograph suggested interest that went beyond administrative assistance. I was documenting personal correspondence, financial records, and intimate family photographs that seemed irrelevant to property security. The agency began requesting more detailed reports about each property, including information about the personal lives and circumstances of the homeowners based on what I observed during cleaning. They wanted to know about medication schedules, social relationships, and lifestyle patterns that could be determined from examining personal belongings. When I expressed discomfort with gathering such intimate information about the homeowners, the agency reminded me that understanding client circumstances was essential for providing appropriate property management services. Elderly or vulnerable clients often needed additional support that required awareness of their personal situations. Around the 6th week of my employment with the agency, I was assigned to clean a property that belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson. Unlike the other homes on my route, this property showed clear signs that the owner had not left voluntarily for business travel. The house contained evidence of a struggle, with furniture overturned, personal belongings scattered, and signs that someone had been searching through drawers and cabinets. The home felt like a crime scene, rather than a property requiring maintenance cleaning while the owner traveled. When I contacted the agency about the condition of Mrs. Henderson's home, they explained that she had suffered a medical emergency while preparing for a trip and had been hospitalized. The family had asked for emergency cleaning services to secure the property while they dealt with the medical crisis. This explanation seemed reasonable enough, but I was troubled by the specific cleaning instructions for Mrs. Henderson's property. Instead of focusing on tidying up after the medical emergency, I was asked to photograph all personal documents, inventory jewelry and valuables, and document any information about bank accounts or financial arrangements. These tasks felt more like systematic robbery than cleaning services for a family dealing with a medical emergency. I was essentially cataloging everything of value in the home and documenting personal information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. When I tried to refuse these expanded responsibilities, the agency pointed out that I had already been gathering similar information from other properties for several weeks. They reminded me that I had signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements that covered all aspects of the property management services I was providing. They also mentioned that I had gained access to sensitive information about multiple clients and their personal circumstances. This knowledge made me a valuable part of their operation, but it also meant that ending my employment would require careful consideration of security implications. The agency began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our employment relationship. They made references to my financial difficulties, housing situation, and daily routine that suggested they had been conducting background research into my own life. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my activities and communications were being monitored. The agency was applying the same intelligence-gathering techniques to my personal life that I had been using to gather information about their clients' circumstances. I realized that the cleaning work had been used to recruit me into systematic burglary and identity theft operations disguised as property management services. The homes I had been cleaning belonged to vulnerable people who had been targeted for exploitation, and I had been gathering the intelligence needed to rob them systematically. The properties weren't owned by traveling business professionals at all. They belonged to elderly or vulnerable people who had been removed from their homes through various means, allowing the agency to access their properties and personal information without interference. Mrs. Henderson's case was probably typical of how the operation worked. Vulnerable people were identified and their circumstances manipulated to create opportunities for accessing their homes and gathering information about their assets and personal lives. When I attempted to report my suspicions to the police, I discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The cleaning work had been presented as legitimate property management services. The confidentiality agreements I had signed covered various types of administrative assistance, and the personal information I had gathered could be justified as necessary for proper client care. The agency had structured their operations to make the systematic robbery and identity theft appear like legitimate property management work. Proving criminal intent would require evidence that went beyond what I could provide based on my limited knowledge of their overall operations. The agency continued to contact me for several months after I stopped working for them, offering additional cleaning assignments and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined the full scope of their operations or what happened to the people whose homes I had been systematically cataloging. The combination of property access, personal intelligence gathering, and sophisticated methods for targeting vulnerable individuals suggested an organization capable of extensive financial and personal exploitation. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting people into criminal operations by presenting theft and fraud as legitimate employment opportunities. They understood how to exploit financial desperation to recruit accomplices who would provide detailed intelligence about potential victims' assets and vulnerabilities. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire for steady employment had been transformed into participation in systematic victimization of vulnerable people. The cleaning work had been a recruitment method designed to identify people desperate enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for regular income. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar property management companies, offering cleaning and administrative work that pays well for what appears to be basic domestic services. The positions they advertise always involve working with elderly or traveling clients, always require strict confidentiality, and always include responsibilities that go beyond typical cleaning work. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing legitimate property management services while actually participating in systematic robbery and exploitation of vulnerable homeowners. The police came to my door 3 times before I finally let them in. Not because I was being difficult, but because I genuinely didn't know what to tell them that wouldn't sound completely insane. How do you explain to 2 officers from West Midlands Police that you've witnessed a murder, that you know exactly who did it and roughly where it happened, but you can't tell them how you know because the explanation involves admitting you were somewhere online you absolutely shouldn't have been? I'm sitting in what they call protective custody now, a safe house in Wolverhampton that smells of cigarettes and cheap air freshener. And I still don't know if I did the right thing by coming forward. My name's Helen. I'm 53 years old, and until 6 weeks ago, I was living a completely ordinary life in Birmingham, working as a medical secretary. Then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see, and now everything's different. It started with insomnia, which probably sounds like a boring way to begin a story about witnessing a murder, but that's genuinely how it happened. I'd been having trouble sleeping for months after my divorce was finalized. Nothing dramatic. David and I had just grown apart after 26 years of marriage. No affairs, no big arguments, just a slow realization that we'd become strangers who happened to share a house. The divorce itself was remarkably civil, but afterwards I found myself lying awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, my mind racing through decades of memories and wondering where it had all gone wrong. I'd scroll through my phone for hours, news articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed. Anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard: meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I'd scroll through my phone for hours, news articles, social media, online shopping I never actually completed. Anything to distract myself from the silence of the empty house. That's when I started noticing the adverts for insomnia remedies and sleep aids that seemed to follow me around every website. The algorithms had clearly identified me as someone struggling with sleep, and they were determined to sell me solutions. One advert caught my attention because it wasn't selling anything. It was just a link to an article about alternative approaches to insomnia, things beyond the usual advice about sleep hygiene and avoiding screens before bed. The article itself was fairly standard: meditation techniques, dietary changes, that sort of thing. But at the bottom was a link to what it described as a community for people with severe sleep problems, a support group that operated through private channels to protect members' privacy. I should have been immediately suspicious of anything that emphasized privacy and private channels that much. But I was desperate and lonely, and 2 o'clock in the morning makes terrible decisions seem reasonable. I clicked the link and found myself on a website that looked like it had been designed in about 1998. Basic text, minimal formatting, just a simple registration form for joining their community. The registration process was more complex than I'd expected. It required downloading specific software that would let me access their private discussion spaces. Something about protecting members' anonymity and ensuring a safe space for people to discuss their struggles without judgment. The software took nearly an hour to set up properly, and I almost gave up several times when it seemed too complicated for what should have been a simple support group. But eventually I got it working and found myself looking at what appeared to be a fairly standard online community. Discussion boards about different types of sleep problems, threads where people shared what had worked for them, even a section for just general chat among insomniacs who were awake at odd hours. I spent a few nights just reading through discussions, occasionally posting my own experiences and getting sympathetic responses from other members. It was comforting in a way, realizing I wasn't alone in lying awake at 3 in the morning, feeling like the only person in the world who couldn't sleep. But I started noticing that some sections of the community were restricted, requiring additional permissions to access. When I asked about this in one of the public discussion areas, someone explained that the restricted sections were for members who'd been active in the community for a while and had established trust with other participants. It was apparently meant to create more intimate discussion spaces for people dealing with particularly difficult situations. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. Online communities often have different tiers of access based on participation and trust. I continued posting in the public areas, and after about 2 weeks received a notification that I'd been granted access to some of the restricted sections. The restricted discussions were more personal and raw than what I'd seen in the public areas. People talking about the real reasons they couldn't sleep. Trauma, grief, guilt about things they'd done or failed to do. It felt like being trusted with genuine human vulnerability, and I found myself sharing more honestly about the sadness and loss I was feeling after my divorce. But there was another category of restricted sections that I still couldn't access. Discussions that required what the system called verified membership. I didn't think much about it initially. Presumably, those were for people who'd been active in the community even longer than I had. It was about 3 weeks into my participation when someone sent me a private message offering to sponsor me for verified membership. They explained that verified sections dealt with particularly sensitive topics that required absolute discretion, and that sponsorship from an existing verified member was how they controlled access to ensure the community remained safe. The person seemed genuine in their messages, and they'd been helpful to me in several public discussions about managing anxiety-related insomnia. They explained that verified sections included discussions about topics that mainstream platforms wouldn't allow, controversial treatment approaches, substances that helped with sleep but weren't technically legal, that sort of thing. I was uncomfortable with the implications, but also curious about what kind of discussions required such elaborate security. The message emphasized that verification was completely optional, that I was welcome to continue participating in the non-verified sections, but that some members found the verified discussions particularly helpful for their most difficult struggles. I accepted the sponsorship partly out of curiosity, and partly because by that point I'd been awake since midnight. and my judgment was impaired by exhaustion. The verification process required confirming my identity through several steps that seemed excessive for an insomnia support group, but I completed them anyway. When I finally gained access to the verified sections, I immediately realized this wasn't about insomnia treatment at all. The discussions were about accessing illegal content, trading various prohibited materials, even coordinating activities that were obviously criminal in nature. I'd somehow ended up in what I later learned was a dark web community that used the insomnia support group as a front for recruiting people into their actual operations. I should have immediately closed the software and deleted everything. Should have reported what I'd found to authorities and moved on with my life. But I was frozen by a combination of shock and morbid fascination. I'd stumbled into a part of the internet I'd only heard about in news reports, and some awful part of me wanted to understand what I was actually looking at. The discussions were coded and cryptic, using language that clearly meant something other than what the words literally said. People weren't directly stating criminal intentions. Everything was framed in theoretical or hypothetical terms, but the context made it obvious what they were actually discussing. I found myself scrolling through these discussions over several nights, trying to understand the scope of what I'd accidentally accessed. There were sections for different types of illegal activities, all disguised behind innocuous-sounding category names that wouldn't mean anything to casual observers. That's when I found the section that changed everything. It was labeled something bland like social meetups, but when I clicked through, I found discussions about coordinating what were clearly violent crimes against specific individuals. People were sharing detailed information about targets, their routines, their vulnerabilities, even photographs and addresses. One thread in particular made me feel physically sick. It was discussing someone named Sarah Chen, a woman in her early 30s who apparently lived somewhere in the West Midlands. The thread included dozens of photographs of her going about her daily life, shopping, walking to work, sitting in cafes. Someone had been systematically documenting her movements over what looked like several weeks. The discussion around these photographs was careful and coded, but the intent was clear enough that I couldn't pretend I didn't understand what I was reading. People were planning to harm this woman, discussing the best approaches and timing, even coordinating who would do what. What made it worse was seeing the casual tone of these discussions. People were planning violence with the same matter-of-fact language you'd use to organize a dinner party. There were even jokes and casual banter between the participants, as if coordinating serious harm against a stranger was just another form of social interaction. I spent the rest of that night trying to work out what to do with what I'd discovered. I couldn't report it to the police without admitting I'd accessed these illegal websites, which would presumably make me complicit in whatever was being planned. But I couldn't just ignore it, knowing that a real person was being systematically stalked and threatened. I tried researching Sarah Chen through normal internet searches, hoping to find her social media or some other way to warn her. But the name was common enough that I couldn't identify which of the various Sarah Chens in the West Midlands was the one being targeted. And even if I could find her, what would I say? That I'd been browsing illegal websites and saw her being discussed. I stopped accessing the community entirely after that night, deleted the software from my computer, and tried to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood what I was reading. Maybe the discussions were just disturbing fantasies that would never translate into actual harm. Maybe I was being paranoid and overreacting to something that was just tasteless internet conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen going about her ordinary life, completely unaware that strangers were documenting her movements and discussing how to harm her. Every time I tried to sleep, I'd see those images. Imagine her not knowing she was being watched and targeted. It was about 2 weeks later when I saw the news report. A woman's body had been found in a wooded area near Sutton Coldfield. She'd been missing for several days before hikers discovered her. The news initially didn't release her name pending family notification, but something about the location and timing made my stomach drop. When they finally identified her as Sarah Chen, 32, from Birmingham, I knew immediately that I'd watched people planning her murder and done nothing to stop it. I'd seen the discussions, seen the photographs, understood enough of what was being coordinated to know she was in danger. And I'd convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. I spent 3 days in a kind of paralyzed horror, unable to eat or sleep properly, replaying everything I'd read and wondering if reporting it earlier could have saved her life. The police were appealing for information, asking anyone who'd seen anything suspicious to come forward. But how could I explain what I knew without admitting I'd accessed those websites? That's when the police came to my door the first time. They were conducting house-to-house inquiries in the area where Sarah Chen had worked, which was near the medical practice where I was employed. They asked standard questions about whether I'd seen anything unusual, whether I knew the victim, that sort of thing. I told them no, I didn't know her and hadn't seen anything relevant. They thanked me for my time and left, and I felt like the worst kind of coward for not telling them what I actually knew. They came back the second time because they were expanding their inquiries and wanted to know if I'd remembered anything additional. Again, I said no, and again, they left. This time, one of the officers gave me his card and said to call if anything came to mind, no matter how insignificant it might seem. I spent that night staring at his card, trying to work up the courage to call and explain what I'd seen online. But every time I reached for my phone, I'd think about having to admit I'd accessed those illegal websites, about potentially being prosecuted for involvement in something I'd stumbled into by accident. The third time they came to my door, they weren't there for routine inquiries. They'd apparently received information that connected me to the online community somehow. I never learned exactly how they'd traced me, but presumably the people running those websites kept records that law enforcement had eventually accessed. The officers explained that they knew I'd accessed certain websites and communities, and they wanted to know what I'd seen there. They weren't arresting me or accusing me of involvement in Sarah Chen's murder, but they needed any information I had about the discussions and coordination that had happened online. That's when I finally told them everything. About the insomnia support group, that wasn't what it seemed. About stumbling into sections discussing illegal activities. About the specific thread discussing Sarah Chen and the photographs documenting her movements. About reading those discussions and understanding enough to know she was in danger, but convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility to report it. The officers were professional, but I could see the frustration in their expressions. If I'd reported what I'd seen immediately, they might have been able to intervene before Sarah Chen was killed. My delay had potentially cost her life, even if I wasn't directly involved in planning or executing the murder. They took detailed statements about everything I'd seen in those discussions. Usernames I remembered, specific details about what had been posted, even technical information about how I'd accessed the community in the first place. Then they explained that I'd need to be placed in protective custody while they investigated the extent of my involvement and determined whether the people running those communities knew I'd spoken to police. That's how I ended up in this safe house in Wolverhampton, waiting to find out if I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites or if my cooperation has earned me some form of immunity. The officers who check on me daily have explained that the investigation is expanding beyond just Sarah Chen's murder. They've discovered extensive criminal coordination happening through that community, including planning for additional violent crimes that haven't been carried out yet. They've asked me to testify about what I saw, to help them understand how the community was organized and how people coordinated their activities. I've agreed, partly because I want to help prevent what happened to Sarah Chen from happening to anyone else, and partly because I'm hoping cooperation will reduce whatever legal consequences I'm facing for accessing those websites. But mostly I've agreed because I'm living with the knowledge that I could have prevented a murder and chose not to because I was too frightened of the personal consequences of coming forward. I saw someone being targeted for violence, understood enough to know she was in real danger, and convinced myself it wasn't my responsibility to get involved. The protection officer who stays here overnight tells me not to blame myself too much, that people make difficult decisions when they're frightened and uncertain about consequences. But I can't stop thinking about Sarah Chen, going about her ordinary life in those photographs, completely unaware that her movements were being documented and discussed by people planning to kill her. And I can't stop wondering about all the other discussions I saw in those verified sections, all the other targets who might be in danger while people coordinate harm against them through those same coded conversations. The investigation is ongoing and police are apparently making arrests, but they've told me the community was large and distributed across multiple platforms, making it difficult to identify everyone involved. I spend most of my time in this safe house thinking about how easily I stumbled into that community, how a simple search for insomnia help led me to discover systematic coordination of serious crimes. How many other people have accidentally accessed those spaces and then kept quiet because they were frightened of consequences? The protection officer also mentioned that I might be in danger from people who ran that community if they've identified me as someone who spoke to police. Apparently, there have been incidents of witnesses being targeted by criminal networks operating through these hidden online spaces, though she was vague about details. So now I sit here waiting to learn both whether I'll be prosecuted for accessing those websites and whether I'm in danger from the people who ran them, waiting to testify about what I saw, about the discussions coordinating Sarah Chen's murder that I read and understood and did nothing about until it was too late. The insomnia that started this whole situation has gotten worse, not better. I lie awake now thinking about those photographs of Sarah Chen, wondering if she ever felt like she was being watched, if she ever had that uncomfortable sense that something wasn't right, wondering if my reporting the discussions earlier would have made any difference, or if the coordination was already too far along to stop. The police have told me they found evidence in the arrested suspect's possessions that matched details from the discussions I described, proof that those online conversations weren't just disturbing fantasies, but actual coordination of real crimes. Multiple people working together to stalk, target, and ultimately kill someone they'd probably never met before, deciding she'd be their victim. They won't tell me why Sarah Chen was targeted or how she'd been selected, just that she appears to have been chosen somewhat randomly by people who treated violence as a form of entertainment or social bonding. The thought that someone could be murdered, not for any specific reason, but just because strangers online decided to coordinate killing someone, is almost more disturbing than any other explanation. I keep thinking about how I accessed that community looking for help with insomnia, seeking connection with other people struggling with the same ordinary problem. How that simple, harmless desire for community and understanding led me to discover the coordination of a murder. How easily I could have never seen those discussions, never learned what was being planned, never carried this knowledge that I could have prevented someone's death. The protection officer tells me the investigation has led to multiple arrests and prevented at least one other planned attack that was being coordinated through the same community. She says my information was valuable and helped police understand how these groups operate and coordinate their activities. But that doesn't change the fact that Sarah Chen is dead and I saw it being planned and stayed silent. I don't know what happens next, whether I'll be able to return to my normal life or whether I'll always be looking over my shoulder wondering if the people from that community are looking for me, whether I'll face prosecution for accessing those websites, or whether my cooperation will be considered sufficient mitigation. What I do know is that I'll never again think of the internet as a space where criminal activity is somehow distant or unreal. I've seen real violence being planned through casual online discussions, seen how easily people can coordinate serious harm through these hidden communities that most people don't even know exist. And I'll never forget Sarah Chen's face in those photographs, going about her ordinary life completely unaware that strangers were watching and planning and coordinating the violence that would eventually kill her. Never forget that I could have prevented it and chose not to, because I was frightened of consequences that now seem trivial compared to the cost of my silence. I was looking for cheap furniture online when I found photographs of my grandmother's sitting room, posted 3 weeks before she died. I only discovered this because I was trying to find cheap furniture for my first proper flat after graduating from Cardiff. Estate sales were brilliant for picking up decent pieces without paying retail prices, and there were several websites that specialized in house clearances where the family either couldn't be bothered with the hassle or lived too far away to deal with it properly. Most of these sites were straightforward. Photographs of rooms full of furniture, descriptions of individual pieces, contact details for viewing appointments. But I kept finding listings that seemed too good to be true, offering valuable antiques and collectibles at prices that made no sense unless something was seriously wrong with them. That's how I ended up browsing the darker corners of online estate sales, places where people sold items that might not have been acquired through entirely legitimate means. There were no obviously stolen items, only house clearances and estate sales with unclear provenance and ownership documents. As I scrolled through a site specializing in urgent clearances, I came across a listing that left me speechless. It was titled Complete House Contents, Elderly Lady, Cardiff Area, and the main photograph showed my grandmother's sitting room, exactly as I remembered it from my last visit. The listing had been posted 3 weeks earlier. My grandmother had died 5 days ago. According to the sale description, the contents belonged to an elderly woman who had recently passed away, and the family wanted everything cleared quickly. They were offering the entire house contents as individual lots: furniture, ornaments, books, even kitchen equipment and bedding. The photographs showed every room in comprehensive detail. But my grandmother had been alive and living independently when these photos were taken. I recognized specific arrangements that she'd changed just days before her death. A vase she'd moved from the windowsill to the mantelpiece, magazines that had been on her coffee table, even the way she'd arranged her medication on the kitchen counter. Someone had been inside her house, cataloguing everything she owned while she was still living there. The photographs were professional quality, taken with proper lighting equipment and careful composition. Not the sort of quick snapshots you'd expect from someone hastily clearing a house after a death. These had been planned and executed systematically, documenting every valuable item and piece of furniture. What made it worse was the level of detail. The photographer had opened wardrobes and drawers, cataloguing jewelry, personal documents, even clothing. They'd moved items around to get better shots, rearranged furniture to show pieces more clearly, This wasn't a quick survey. Someone had spent hours going through my grandmother's possessions. I tried contacting the seller through the site's messaging system, claiming I was interested in viewing the items. The response came back within hours, professional and businesslike, offering to arrange access to the property for serious buyers. They even provided an address, my grandmother's actual address. When I asked how soon the items would be available, they said the house would be accessible within the week, pending final legal clearances. They seemed completely confident that they'd have full access to sell everything, as if my grandmother's death had been a certainty rather than the sudden heart attack that had actually killed her. I showed the listing to my mum, who was handling the funeral arrangements and probate. She went white when she saw the photographs, immediately recognizing not just the house, but specific items that she'd been planning to keep as mementos. The seller was offering her own mother's engagement ring, the dining table where we'd had family meals, even the china set that was supposed to pass to my cousin. We called the police, but explaining the situation was complicated. How do you report that someone photographed your grandmother's possessions before she died and was now trying to sell them illegally? The officer we spoke to seemed confused about whether any actual crime had been committed. Technically, nothing had been stolen yet, and proving that someone had entered the house without permission would be difficult. The police did agree to check the property for signs of forced entry, but they found nothing obvious. All the locks were intact, windows secure, no indication that anyone had broken in. Either the photographer had used a key, or they'd found another way inside that left no traces. That's when I started thinking about who would have had access to my grandmother's house in the weeks before her death. She'd been having problems with her heating system and had arranged for several repair visits. The council had also sent someone to assess whether she qualified for additional support services. There had been a meter reader, a postman delivering a registered letter, even someone from her insurance company who'd wanted to inspect the property for a policy renewal. Any of these people could have taken photographs while they were legitimately inside the house, or they could have made copies of keys, noted security vulnerabilities, gathered information that would allow them to return later when she was out shopping or visiting friends. My grandmother had been trusting of people in official capacities. If someone had arrived with proper identification and a reasonable explanation for why they needed access, she would have let them in without question. She'd grown up in an era when you could generally trust people who claimed to represent legitimate organizations. I started researching the other listings on the same website, looking for similar cases where houses had been photographed and catalogued before the owners had actually died. What I found was a pattern that made my hands shake as I scrolled through the results. Dozens of properties, all belonging to elderly people living alone, all photographed in the same professional style with the same comprehensive documentation. Most of the listings claimed the owners had recently passed away, or that families wanted quick clearances for unspecified reasons. But when I cross-referenced the addresses with death notices and obituaries, I found several cases where the photographs had been taken weeks or even months before the actual deaths. Someone was systematically documenting the possessions of elderly people, then waiting for them to die so they could claim ownership of everything they'd catalogued. Some of the cases were even more disturbing. Properties where the photographs showed clear signs of neglect or health problems, medication bottles scattered around, mobility aids, evidence of declining self-care, as if someone was specifically targeting vulnerable people who might be approaching the end of their lives. The website itself was sophisticated, with proper payment systems and customer support. This wasn't some amateur operation run by opportunistic thieves. Someone had built a comprehensive business around predicting and profiting from elderly deaths. I tried reporting what I'd found to action on elder abuse, but they said they needed more concrete evidence of actual crimes before they could intervene. Photographing someone's possessions wasn't illegal if you had permission to be in their house, and proving that permission hadn't been given would require testimony from victims who were no longer alive. The police were equally unhelpful. They agreed that the whole thing sounded suspicious, but without evidence of theft or fraud, there was little they could do. They suggested that the photographs might have been taken by legitimate estate valuers or insurance assessors, and that the timing was just an unfortunate coincidence. But I knew it wasn't coincidence. Someone had been inside my grandmother's house, planning to steal everything she owned, weeks before she died. The fact that they seemed confident about gaining access to sell her possessions suggested they weren't just waiting for natural death. They might have been actively contributing to it. I started looking more carefully at the circumstances of my grandmother's death. She'd had a heart attack while at home alone, found by a neighbor who'd noticed she hadn't collected her milk for 2 days. The doctor who certified the death said it was consistent with her age and medical history. Nothing suspicious enough to warrant an inquest. But my grandmother had been in relatively good health for her age. She'd been managing her medication properly, eating well, maintaining her independence. The heart attack had come suddenly, without the warning signs you'd normally expect from someone with underlying cardiac problems. I requested copies of her medical records from the weeks before her death, looking for any evidence that someone might have been interfering with her medication or healthcare. What I found was a series of appointments and visits that didn't match what my family had been told about her condition. There had been 3 home visits from people claiming to represent her GP surgery, supposedly checking on her well-being and medication compliance. But when I contacted the surgery, they had no record of arranging these visits. They said they would never send unqualified staff to patients' homes without proper documentation and family notification. Someone had been visiting my grandmother regularly in the weeks before her death, posing as healthcare workers with access to her medication and potentially the opportunity to cause the heart attack that killed her. I tried presenting this evidence to the police, but they said it was too circumstantial to justify reopening the case. Elderly people often confuse details about medical appointments, and proving that unauthorized people had accessed her medication would require toxicology tests that hadn't been performed during the original death investigation. Meanwhile, the online listing for her possessions remained active. The seller had updated the description to say that the property was now available for immediate clearance, and several valuable items had already been marked as sold. Someone was actively profiting from my grandmother's death, selling her possessions to buyers who had no idea they were purchasing the proceeds of what might have been murder. I tried bidding on some of the items myself, hoping to prevent them from being sold to strangers, but the seller seemed to have other buyers lined up. People were willing to pay premium prices for specific pieces, as if they'd been planning their purchases in advance. The most disturbing possibility was that the buyers were part of the same operation, that someone was running a comprehensive business that included targeting elderly victims, arranging their deaths, and selling their possessions to clients who appreciated the efficiency of the service. I started monitoring other listings on the same website, looking for properties that might be next on their target list. What I found were dozens of houses belonging to elderly people who were still alive, all photographed in the same professional style, all listed as coming soon or pending availability. Someone was building an inventory of elderly people's possessions, planning their deaths in advance, and taking orders from buyers who were happy to wait for their preferred items to become available through estate clearances. I tried warning some of the people whose houses had been photographed, but most of them didn't believe me. Elderly people who lived alone were often suspicious of strangers making unusual claims, and they had no way to verify that their houses had been secretly documented by people planning to kill them. The few who did take me seriously often didn't know what to do with the information. Calling the police to report that someone might be planning to murder them for their possessions sounded like paranoia, especially when the evidence was just photographs on a website they couldn't access themselves. I considered going to the media, but explaining about dark web marketplaces and estate sale fraud would require revealing how I'd found the information in the first place. Most journalists wouldn't be able to verify the websites or access the evidence needed to substantiate the story. Instead, I started documenting everything myself. Screenshots of listings, records of which properties had been photographed and when, cross-references with subsequent death notices and estate sales, building a comprehensive database that might eventually be useful to law enforcement, even if they weren't ready to act on it yet. What I discovered was that the operation was much larger than I'd initially realized. The same seller had listings for properties across Wales and Western England, suggesting a network of people who specialized in targeting elderly victims in multiple regions. Some of the photographs showed signs that the documentation process was becoming more systematic. Earlier listings were relatively simple, just showing furniture and valuable items. But more recent ones included detailed inventories, professional valuations, even photographs of documents like wills and insurance policies. Someone was expanding their business model, gathering information that would allow them to maximize profits from each victim. Not just stealing possessions, but potentially manipulating inheritance arrangements and insurance claims to extract maximum value from each death they arranged. I'm still monitoring the websites, still documenting new listings, and trying to warn potential victims when I can identify them. But I know I'm fighting something much larger and more organized than I can handle alone. My grandmother's possessions are gone now, sold to buyers who will never know they were purchased with blood money. Her house has been cleared and put up for rent, with no trace remaining of the life she'd built there over 60 years. The people responsible are still operating, still photographing elderly people's homes, still planning deaths and estate sales with the efficiency of any other business venture. And somewhere out there, other families are probably discovering that their grandparents' possessions were being catalogued and sold before they'd even died. The worst part is knowing that this will keep happening until someone with proper authority takes it seriously. But elderly people die every day, and most families are too grief-stricken to question whether their loved ones' deaths were really as natural as they appeared. The ideal cover for a murder business that operates in plain sight, posing as legitimate estate clearances and house sales. It was a Friday when I first read about it. Hindsight is always 20/20, but looking back, I should have walked away. From the moment they offered to pay me for participating in what they called a wellness study, I should have walked away. But when you're desperate enough to consider medical trials as a source of income, you're probably vulnerable enough to ignore warning signs that would be obvious under normal circumstances. But desperation has a way of making terrible decisions seem perfectly reasonable. The advertisement appeared on one of those local community boards where people sell furniture and advertise services. It looked professional enough, with a proper logo and contact information for what claimed to be a private health research company. They were looking for participants between 30 and 50 years old to take part in a study examining the effects of lifestyle changes on mental well-being and cognitive function. I had recently been made redundant from my job at a marketing firm in Leicester, and the severance package was running low after months of unsuccessful job applications. The study offered decent compensation for what seemed like minimal effort, involving regular health assessments and lifestyle monitoring over a period of several weeks. The initial screening process was thorough and professional. They conducted comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations, asking detailed questions about my health history, family background, and current life circumstances. The researchers seemed particularly interested in my stress levels, social support systems, and coping mechanisms for dealing with difficult situations. They explained that the study was investigating how environmental and social factors affect mental health outcomes in people experiencing significant life transitions. As someone who had recently lost their job and was struggling with financial insecurity, I apparently fit their target demographic perfectly. The compensation was substantial enough to cover my rent and basic expenses for the duration of the study, which was scheduled to last approximately 3 months. They explained that participants would receive regular health monitoring, including blood tests, cognitive assessments, and psychological evaluations, along with personalized recommendations for lifestyle improvements. What made the study particularly appealing was that most of the participation could be completed from home. They provided participants with various monitoring devices and applications that would track sleep patterns, physical activity, and other health indicators. We were also given access to online resources, including guided meditation programs, nutritional planning tools, and stress management techniques. The first few weeks of participation were exactly as advertised. I received regular check-ins from the research team, underwent periodic health assessments, and followed personalized wellness plans that seemed genuinely beneficial for my physical and mental health. The monitoring devices provided interesting insights into my daily routines and health patterns. The online resources they provided were surprisingly comprehensive and effective. The meditation programs helped me manage the anxiety associated with unemployment, and the nutritional guidance helped me maintain better eating habits despite my reduced income. I actually felt healthier and more mentally balanced than I had in months. However, around the 4th week of the study, the researchers began requesting additional information that seemed to go beyond what would be necessary for a wellness study. They wanted detailed reports about my daily activities, social interactions, and emotional responses to various situations throughout each day. They explained that understanding the complete context of participants' lives was essential for interpreting the health data they were collecting. Environmental factors, social relationships, and daily stresses all played crucial roles in determining how wellness interventions would be most effective for different individuals. The reporting requirements gradually became more intensive and invasive. I was asked to document not just my own activities and emotional states, but also information about the people I interacted with, the topics we discussed, and my observations about their emotional states and life circumstances. When I questioned why the study needed such detailed information about my social interactions, the researchers explained that social support systems were crucial factors in mental health outcomes. Understanding the quality and nature of my relationships would help them develop more effective wellness interventions for people in similar circumstances. This seemed like a reasonable explanation for legitimate health research, but the specific questions they asked about my social interactions felt increasingly intrusive. They wanted to know about private conversations, personal details that friends and family had shared with me, and my assessments of other people's psychological states and vulnerabilities. Around the 6th week of the study, the researchers began providing me with specific guidance about how to conduct these social interactions. They suggested conversation topics that would be useful to explore with different people, and they provided questions that might help me gather more detailed information about others' personal circumstances and emotional states. They explained that part of the wellness intervention involved learning better communication skills and developing deeper social connections. The guided conversation techniques they were teaching would help me build stronger relationships while also providing valuable research data about social interaction patterns. The conversation techniques were surprisingly effective at encouraging people to share personal information and emotional vulnerabilities. Friends and family members began opening up to me about problems and concerns they had never discussed before, often providing intimate details about their relationships, finances, and personal struggles. The researchers seemed particularly interested in this information about my social network. They requested detailed reports about what I'd learned about each person's circumstances, their psychological vulnerabilities, and their responses to different types of emotional support or advice. When I realized that I was essentially being trained to gather detailed psychological intelligence about my friends and family, I became deeply uncomfortable with the direction the study was taking. The wellness research had evolved into something that felt more like social surveillance than health monitoring. I tried to discuss these concerns with the research team, but they reminded me that I had signed comprehensive consent forms that covered various aspects of social and environmental health research. They assured me that all information would be kept strictly confidential and used only for legitimate research purposes. They also pointed out that I had been receiving significant health benefits from the study participation, including medical monitoring and wellness interventions that would have cost thousands of pounds if purchased privately. The social interaction components were simply part of a holistic approach to health research that recognized the importance of relationships in overall well-being. Around the 8th week of the study, the researchers began requesting that I use the conversation techniques and relationship-building skills I had learned to gather information about people outside my immediate social circle. They wanted me to engage with neighbors, acquaintances, and even strangers to practice the communication methods and document the results. They explained that developing social confidence and communication skills was an important component of mental health improvement. Learning to connect with a broader range of people would help me build a more robust social support system, which was crucial for long-term psychological resilience. This expansion of the social research beyond my existing relationships felt like a significant escalation in the invasiveness of the study. I was being asked to systematically gather personal information about people who had no knowledge that they were being studied, or that their private communications were being documented and reported. When I tried to refuse this expansion of my research responsibilities, the team pointed out that I had been participating in the study for nearly 2 months and had received substantial compensation and health benefits. The social interaction research was an integral part of the wellness program, and withdrawing from this component would compromise the validity of all the health data they had been collecting. They also mentioned that the psychological and social information I had already provided about my friends and family represented a significant investment in understanding my complete social environment. This information would be valuable for developing personalized health interventions, but it also meant that I had detailed knowledge of other people's private circumstances that required careful handling. The researchers began demonstrating knowledge of my personal activities and relationships that extended far beyond what I had reported to them through the official study protocols. They made references to conversations I had had, places I had visited, and people I had interacted with that suggested they were monitoring my activities through means other than the devices and reports I was providing. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear indications that my communications and movements were being tracked and analyzed. The monitoring devices they had provided for the health study apparently had capabilities that extended far beyond tracking sleep patterns and physical activity. I realized that the wellness study had been used to establish comprehensive surveillance of my personal life and social relationships. The health monitoring devices had been used to track my location and activities, while the social interaction training had been used to recruit me as an intelligence gatherer targeting my own friends and family. The medical assessments and wellness interventions had been genuine, but they were also tools for establishing trust and dependency that would ensure my continued cooperation with surveillance activities that had nothing to do with health research. The compensation I had received was payment for providing detailed intelligence about vulnerable people in my social network. When I attempted to withdraw from the study entirely, the researchers pointed out that I had gained access to advanced communication and psychological assessment techniques that were valuable and potentially sensitive. They also reminded me that I possessed detailed personal information about other study participants and research methods that required careful protection. They suggested that ending my participation abruptly could create complications for ongoing research involving other participants, particularly since I had developed relationships and gathered information that were integral to understanding social network dynamics in their study population. The surveillance of my activities continued after I tried to end my participation in the study. The researchers maintained contact through various channels, occasionally sending references to my current activities to demonstrate that their monitoring capabilities remained active and comprehensive. I tried reporting my concerns to the medical ethics authorities, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The health research had been conducted according to apparently legitimate protocols. The consent forms I had signed covered various types of social and environmental research, and the ongoing contact could be justified as necessary follow-up for medical studies involving psychological interventions. The study had been presented through legitimate medical research channels. The compensation had been processed through proper financial systems, and the health assessments had been conducted by qualified medical professionals. Proving that the underlying purpose was systematic surveillance rather than wellness research would have been nearly impossible. The researchers continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering opportunities to participate in follow-up studies and additional wellness programs. They occasionally sent subtle references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. I never determined who was ultimately directing the research or what they were using the detailed personal and social information for. The systematic gathering of psychological intelligence about vulnerable people, combined with sophisticated methods for recruiting unwitting surveillance operatives, suggested an organization with purposes that extended far beyond legitimate health research. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's health concerns and financial vulnerabilities to recruit participants in surveillance operations that targeted not just the participants themselves, but their entire social networks. They understood how to present systematic intelligence gathering as beneficial health research, while using the participants as both subjects and agents for comprehensive social surveillance. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire to improve my health and financial situation had been transformed into participation in the systematic violation of my friends' and family's privacy. The wellness study had been designed to recruit people who were vulnerable enough to ignore ethical concerns in exchange for health benefits and financial compensation. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar health research organizations, offering compensation for participation in wellness studies that would provide valuable health monitoring and lifestyle interventions. The studies they describe always involve comprehensive life monitoring, social interaction research, and access to advanced wellness resources that would be expensive to obtain privately. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are participating in beneficial health research, while actually providing detailed surveillance intelligence about themselves and everyone in their social networks. This is probably going to sound a little harsh, but I honestly wish I had never started helping families find their missing relatives. What began as genuine compassion for people in desperate situations gradually became something much darker, and by the time I understood what was really happening, I had already contributed to activities that still make me feel sick when I think about them. The whole thing started because my neighbor, Patricia, was going through hell trying to find her teenage daughter who had disappeared from their home in Coventry. Sarah had been struggling with depression and had vanished one evening after an argument about her future plans. The police had conducted initial searches, but seemed to lose interest when they determined that Sarah had left voluntarily and was technically old enough to make her own decisions about where to live. Patricia was desperate for help and had heard that private investigators could sometimes find missing people more effectively than official channels. The problem was that legitimate private investigators charged substantial fees that she simply could not afford on her pension. She had already spent most of her savings on distributing missing person flyers and placing advertisements in local newspapers. I felt genuinely sorry for Patricia and offered to help her research alternative methods for finding missing people. I had always been reasonably competent with internet research, and I thought I might be able to find resources or organizations that could assist families in her situation without charging prohibitive fees. My initial research led me to various online communities where families shared information about missing relatives and offered mutual support during their searches. Most of these communities were heartbreaking collections of desperate people trying to maintain hope while dealing with the practical and emotional challenges of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. However, I also discovered that there were more specialized communities that focused on active search techniques rather than just emotional support. These communities included people with technical expertise who volunteered their skills to help families conduct more sophisticated searches than what was typically available through official channels. One particular community caught my attention because they seemed to have genuine success in locating missing people. Their approach involved using advanced internet research techniques to gather information that was not readily available through conventional search methods. They explained that much of the information needed to find missing people existed in digital formats, but accessing it required knowledge of specialized search techniques and alternative internet resources. The community was organized around mutual assistance, with experienced members providing guidance and training to newcomers who wanted to help search for missing people. They emphasized that their methods were completely legal and ethical, focusing on gathering publicly available information through more thorough and systematic approaches than what most families could manage on their own. I contacted the community administrators and explained Patricia's situation. They seemed genuinely sympathetic and offered to provide training that would allow me to conduct more effective searches for Sarah. They explained that having local volunteers who could assist with research was always valuable, particularly for cases involving young people who might be using social media or other online platforms to communicate with friends. The training process was comprehensive and methodical. They provided detailed instructions for accessing various databases and information sources that were not readily discoverable through conventional search engines. Much of this involved learning to navigate areas of the internet that required special software and specific knowledge about where to look for particular types of information. The techniques they taught were remarkably effective. Within a few days of applying their methods, I had discovered several social media accounts and online communications that suggested Sarah was staying with friends in Birmingham. The information was current enough to indicate that she was safe and had simply chosen not to contact her mother directly. Patricia was enormously relieved to learn that Sarah was alive and well, even though she remained hurt that her daughter had not chosen to communicate with her directly. The success of this first search made me feel genuinely helpful and motivated me to continue learning more advanced techniques that might help other families in similar situations. The community administrators were pleased with my progress and invited me to assist with additional cases involving missing people from other parts of the country. They explained that having volunteers who could conduct local research was always valuable, particularly for gathering information that required physical presence in specific geographic areas. Over the following weeks, I helped research several missing person cases, gradually becoming more skilled and using the specialized techniques and information sources that the community had taught me to access. The work was emotionally difficult, but deeply satisfying, particularly when our efforts resulted in successful reunions between families and their missing relatives. However, around the 6th week of my involvement with this community, I began noticing aspects of our research methods that seemed to go beyond what would be necessary for simply locating missing people. We were gathering extremely detailed information about the personal lives, relationships, and daily activities of the people we were searching for, much of which seemed irrelevant to the basic question of where they were currently living. When I raised questions about why we needed such comprehensive personal information, the administrators explained that missing people often went to great lengths to conceal their whereabouts and identities. Understanding their complete social networks, financial circumstances, and personal relationships was necessary to predict where they might go and how they might be contacted. This explanation seemed reasonable for legitimate missing person investigations, but I began paying closer attention to the specific types of information we were gathering and how that information was being used. Much of our research focused on identifying psychological vulnerabilities, financial pressures, and personal relationships that could potentially be exploited to influence the missing people's decisions about where to live and who to trust. Some of the cases we worked on involved people who had deliberately distanced themselves from family members due to abuse, manipulation, or other toxic relationship dynamics. In these situations, our research was effectively providing detailed intelligence about vulnerable people to the same family members they had been trying to escape. When I expressed concerns about potentially helping abusive families locate relatives who had left for their own safety, the administrators assured me that they carefully screened all requests for assistance and would never knowingly help abusers locate their victims. They explained that determining the legitimacy of search requests was a crucial part of their work, and that they had extensive experience in identifying potentially dangerous family situations. However, I began to suspect that the screening process was not as thorough as they claimed. Some of the families we were helping seemed to have relationship dynamics that suggested the missing people might have had legitimate reasons for maintaining distance. The detailed personal information we were gathering would be extremely valuable for manipulation and control, regardless of whether the families had genuinely benevolent intentions. Around the 8th week of my involvement with this community, the administrators began requesting assistance with research projects that had no apparent connection to finding missing people. They wanted detailed information about specific individuals who were not missing, but who they claimed were persons of interest in ongoing missing person investigations. These research assignments involved gathering comprehensive personal information about people who appeared to be living normal lives in their own communities. We were asked to document their daily routines, social relationships, employment circumstances, and potential psychological vulnerabilities, ostensibly to determine whether they might have information relevant to missing person cases. The connection between these surveillance assignments and missing person investigations was tenuous at best. The targets of our research did not appear to have any obvious relationship to missing people, and the information we were gathering seemed more suitable for systematic harassment or manipulation than for legitimate investigative purposes. When I tried to refuse these expanded research assignments, the administrators pointed out that I had gained access to sensitive information about their search techniques and had detailed knowledge of ongoing investigations involving vulnerable missing people. They explained that maintaining the security and confidentiality of their operations required ongoing participation from volunteers who had been trusted with sensitive information. They also began demonstrating knowledge of my personal circumstances that they could not have gathered through our professional relationship. They made references to my daily routine, social relationships, and financial situation that suggested they had been conducting the same type of comprehensive research on me that I had been conducting on missing people and their associates. This pattern of surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear indications that my activities and communications were being monitored and documented. The techniques they were using to gather information about my personal life were identical to the methods they had taught me to use for missing person investigations. I realized that my training in advanced internet research techniques had been used to recruit me into a systematic surveillance operation that had little to do with helping families find missing relatives. The missing person cases had been used to teach me techniques that were then applied to gather intelligence about people who had no connection to missing person investigations. The community had been using legitimate concern for missing people as a recruitment method for volunteers who would provide detailed surveillance research on targets selected for reasons that had nothing to do with missing person investigations. My compassion for families like Patricia's had been exploited to recruit me into activities that were essentially stalking and intelligence gathering. When I attempted to withdraw from the community entirely, I discovered that they considered my knowledge of their techniques and operations to be a security risk that could not simply be ignored. They had invested considerable time in training me to use specialized research methods, and they expected that investment to continue providing value through ongoing research assignments. The surveillance of my personal activities intensified after I tried to end my involvement with their operations. They began sending me detailed information about my daily routine, social interactions, and personal relationships to demonstrate that they could apply their research techniques to my own life just as effectively as I had applied them to their targets. I tried reporting my concerns to the police, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The missing person research had been presented as volunteer work helping desperate families. The techniques I had learned were described as advanced but legal internet research methods, and the ongoing contact could be justified as routine follow-up communication with volunteer organizations. The community continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering opportunities to assist with new missing person cases and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their surveillance capabilities remained active. They seemed to view my knowledge of their techniques and operations as creating ongoing obligations that could not be terminated simply by requesting to stop participating. I never determined what the community was actually using the detailed personal information for, or who was ultimately directing their research activities. The systematic gathering of intelligence about vulnerable people, combined with sophisticated techniques for identifying and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, suggested an organization with purposes that extended far beyond helping families locate missing relatives. What I do understand is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's compassion and desire to help vulnerable individuals to recruit unwitting participants in systematic surveillance operations. They understood how to present stalking and intelligence gathering as humanitarian volunteer work, while using the volunteers as both researchers and test subjects for their surveillance techniques. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my genuine desire to help families find missing loved ones had been transformed into participation in activities that could be used to harm the same types of vulnerable people I had originally wanted to help. The missing person investigations had been recruitment tools designed to teach me surveillance techniques that would then be used for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate search and rescue efforts. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar missing person research communities, offering training opportunities and volunteer positions that would allow me to help desperate families locate their missing relatives. The techniques they describe are always presented as advanced but legal research methods. The cases they want help with always involve sympathetic families, and the training they offer always leads towards sophisticated surveillance capabilities. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I often wonder how many other people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are providing humanitarian assistance to desperate families while actually participating in systematic surveillance operations that target the same types of vulnerable people they thought they were helping to protect. I used to think I was pretty good at staying out of trouble. Always handed assignments in on time, never got into fights, kept my head down and minded my own business. The sort of person teachers liked and parents approved of their kids hanging around with. That all changed when I started my second year at Leeds and got put in halls with Danny Morrison. Danny was one of those people who seemed to attract chaos wherever he went. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't violent or particularly reckless, just someone who always knew people who knew people, if you know what I mean. The type who could get you concert tickets when they were sold out, or help you find textbooks that had mysteriously fallen off the back of a lorry. I liked him well enough. He was funny, generous with his mates, and never pressured anyone to get involved with his various schemes. But living with someone means you inevitably get drawn into their world, even when you're trying to keep your distance from anything dodgy. It started small. Danny would get messages at weird hours, people calling him with requests for things that were hard to come by through normal channels. University accommodation with suspiciously short notice periods. Part-time jobs that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about work permits. Electronics that were significantly cheaper than high street prices, assuming you weren't fussy about receipts or warranties. Most of his business seemed to involve connecting people who needed things with people who could provide them. A middleman operation that kept him just far enough removed from anything obviously illegal, while still making enough money to afford better clothes and nights out than most students could manage. I tried to stay uninvolved, but when you're living on beans and toast while your flatmate is ordering takeaways every night, it's hard not to be curious about how his income stream actually worked. Danny eventually explained that he operated through what he called alternative marketplaces. Websites that functioned like normal classified ads, but were set up to handle transactions that mainstream platforms wouldn't touch. He insisted that nothing was seriously criminal. It was simply a way for people to buy and sell items without having to navigate the bureaucracy required by legitimate businesses. He showed me some of the sites he used, and they looked professional enough. Clean layouts, user ratings, even customer service contact forms. The main difference from normal classified sites was that they were hosted on hidden web addresses that you couldn't access through standard browsers. The products themselves seemed fairly mundane. Electronics, clothing, textbooks, household items, the sort of stuff you'd find on any second-hand marketplace. The prices were good, sometimes suspiciously good, but nothing that screamed stolen goods to anyone who wasn't looking too closely. Danny's role was essentially customer service and logistics. He'd identify people who were looking for specific items, connect them with sellers who could provide them, and handle the complicated bits of arranging payment and delivery, taking a small commission from each transaction while keeping buyers and sellers anonymous from each other. It seemed like a fairly harmless way to make money, helping students and young people who couldn't afford retail prices to find the things they needed. Danny was careful about who he worked with, avoided anything that was stolen or dangerous, and made sure his customers knew exactly what they were getting into. But as I got more familiar with how these marketplaces operated, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. Some of the items being sold were clearly targeted at specific types of buyers. Electronics that had been modified in ways that served no obvious purpose except to make them harder to trace. Clothing and accessories that were described using terminology I didn't recognize, but that seemed to mean something specific to certain customers. More concerning were the services being offered alongside physical products. People's advertising skills and capabilities went well beyond simple buying and selling. Data recovery from damaged devices, document reproduction and verification, even what appeared to be identity verification services that could help people prove they were someone they weren't. Danny insisted that he stuck to straightforward retail transactions and didn't get involved with the more complicated services. But the boundaries seemed fluid, and I could see how easy it would be to gradually expand from selling second-hand electronics to helping people with more questionable requirements. The customer base was also more diverse than I'd initially realized. While many were obviously students and young people looking for bargains, there were also buyers who seemed to have serious money and very specific needs. People who were willing to pay premium prices for items that met particular requirements, even when cheaper alternatives were readily available. These higher-end customers often communicated through Danny rather than dealing directly with sellers, apparently valuing the additional layer of anonymity he provided. They'd send detailed specifications for what they wanted, sometimes including technical requirements that seemed far more complex than anything a normal consumer would need. Danny started spending more time managing these premium customers, and I could see that the money involved was significantly larger than his usual transactions. Instead of making a few pounds commission on student textbooks, he was earning hundreds of pounds for arranging single transactions between serious buyers and specialized sellers. The work was also becoming more demanding. Premium customers expected rapid response times, detailed progress updates, and absolute discretion about their requirements. Danny found himself available at all hours, managing communications between people who operated in different time zones and had very specific ideas about how business should be conducted. But what really worried me was how paranoid he was becoming about security. Danny had always been reasonably careful about his online activities, using VPNs and avoiding leaving obvious traces of his marketplace involvement. But his security measures were becoming much more elaborate, suggesting that he was dealing with people who took anonymity very seriously indeed. He started using multiple phones, different laptops for different types of business, even separate internet connections that he paid for with cash, to avoid any link to his real identity. His room began to look like something from a spy film, with various devices and cables that seemed designed to make his online activities as untraceable as possible. When I asked why all this security was necessary for what he claimed was just second-hand retail, Danny explained that some of his customers were prominent people who couldn't afford to be associated with alternative marketplaces. Business executives, politicians, celebrities, people who needed to maintain public reputations but sometimes required access to products or services that weren't available through conventional channels. That explanation made sense up to a point, but it also raised questions about what exactly these prominent people were buying that required such elaborate secrecy. If it was just discounted electronics or designer clothing, why would they care about being associated with second-hand marketplaces? I started paying closer attention to the messages Danny received from his premium customers, trying to understand what kind of products and services were worth paying such high commission rates for. The requests were often vague, described in terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify what was actually wanted. Customers would ask for documentation packages or verification materials without specifying what these items were supposed to verify. They'd request consultation services or technical assessments without explaining what kind of expertise they needed. But occasionally, the requests were specific enough to be genuinely disturbing. People wanted detailed background information about individuals they claimed to be considering for business partnerships. Others requested access to private social media accounts or email addresses belonging to people they said were involved in legal disputes with them. Some customers wanted help acquiring items that belonged to specific individuals, providing addresses and descriptions that suggested they were planning targeted thefts. Danny insisted that he only handled the communications and logistics, never getting directly involved with whatever his customers actually did with the products or services they purchased. But it was becoming clear that some of these transactions were facilitating activities that went far beyond simple retail commerce. The most concerning development was when customers started requesting information about people in our local area. They'd provide names, addresses, and personal details about individuals living in Leeds, asking for verification services or background research that required someone with local knowledge and access. Danny began receiving requests to visit specific addresses, photograph particular properties, even gather information about people's daily routines and habits. These local reconnaissance requests paid extremely well, often several £100s for what appeared to be straightforward information gathering. But they also meant that Danny was now directly involved in activities that looked suspiciously like stalking or preparation for criminal activity. When I confronted him about this, Danny claimed that the information was being used for legitimate purposes: due diligence for business investments, background checks for potential employees, research for legal proceedings. But he admitted he had no way of verifying what his customers actually did with the intelligence he provided. More troubling was his acknowledgement that some of the people he'd been asked to investigate had subsequently experienced problems. Houses that had been burglarized, cars that had been vandalized, individuals who had received threatening messages or experienced identity theft. Danny insisted these were coincidences, that correlation didn't prove causation, and that he was just providing information that was probably available through other sources anyway. But the pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. I tried convincing him to stop taking the local reconnaissance requests, pointing out that he could be charged as an accessory if any of his customers used the information to commit serious crimes. But the money was too good, and Danny argued that someone else would just take the work if he turned it down. That's when I started documenting everything I could about his operations. I began keeping records of the customers he worked with, the types of requests he received, and their outcomes for people who had been investigated or targeted, building a file that might be useful if I ever needed to distance myself from his activities or provide evidence to authorities. What I discovered was that Danny's operation was much larger and more organized than he'd admitted. He wasn't just a freelance middleman handling occasional transactions. He was part of a network that specialized in providing intelligence and access services to clients who couldn't or wouldn't use legitimate channels. The network included people with skills in surveillance, data recovery, social engineering, and physical security. Customers could commission comprehensive investigations that included online research, physical reconnaissance, and even direct approach operations designed to extract information from targets. Danny's role was primarily handling local operations in the Leeds area, but he was connected to similar operatives in other cities who could provide coverage across the UK. The organization was sophisticated enough to handle complex multi-stage investigations that required coordination between different specialists and geographic regions. Most disturbing was the evidence that some customers were using these services to target vulnerable individuals for exploitation or harm, people in financial distress who could be manipulated into fraudulent schemes, elderly individuals whose personal information could be used for identity theft, young people who could be approached and recruited for various types of criminal activity. I realized that by living with Danny and keeping quiet about his operations, I was potentially complicit in facilitating serious crimes against innocent people. Even if I wasn't directly involved in gathering intelligence or providing services, my silence was enabling activities that were destroying other people's lives. But confronting Danny directly seemed increasingly dangerous. He'd become paranoid about security breaches and was constantly worried about being exposed by customers or competitors. Anyone who posed a threat to his operation was seen as a serious liability that needed to be dealt with. I started making plans to move out of our shared accommodation and distance myself from his activities entirely. But I also knew that simply walking away wouldn't protect me if Danny's customers decided I knew too much about their operations. The people he worked with had demonstrated their willingness to target individuals who posed threats to their interests. And as someone who'd been living with one of their operatives for months, I'd inevitably learn details about their methods and customers that could be damaging if disclosed to authorities. I was trapped between staying involved with activities I knew were harmful and trying to extract myself from a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. That's when Danny disappeared. I came back from lectures one afternoon to find his room completely cleared out, all his equipment gone. No note or explanation about where he'd gone or when he might be back. The only trace of his occupancy was a faint smell of cleaning products that suggested someone had worked very hard to remove any evidence of what had been happening in that room. I tried contacting him through the various phone numbers and email addresses I had, but they'd all been disconnected or abandoned. His social media accounts had been deleted. His university enrollment had been terminated, and none of our mutual friends had heard from him since the day he'd vanished. It was as if Danny Morrison had simply stopped existing. The university housing office eventually assigned me a new flatmate, a quiet engineering student who showed no interest in alternative marketplaces or questionable income streams. Life returned to something approaching normal, and I tried to convince myself that Danny's disappearance was just him moving on to better opportunities elsewhere. But I kept monitoring the hidden marketplaces where he'd operated, looking for signs that his network was still active in the Leeds area. What I found was that the services he'd provided were definitely continuing, but with different operatives handling local operations. New people were offering reconnaissance and intelligence services using the same terminology and methods that Danny had employed. The customer base seemed unchanged, and the types of requests being fulfilled were just as concerning as before. Someone had simply replaced Danny in the network's organizational structure. taking over his customer relationships and operational responsibilities without missing a beat. That suggested his disappearance hadn't been voluntary. Either he'd been eliminated because he'd become a security risk, or he'd been reassigned to different duties that required him to adopt a completely new identity. Either way, it meant that the people running this network were serious enough about operational security to make their own operatives disappear when necessary. And as someone who knew details about their methods and customers, I was probably next on their list of potential security risks that needed to be managed.